Some years ago, along a country road outside of Fresno, California on a windy spring day, a part of the invisible world was made for a brief moment visible to me. In the light lancing through a row of trees, I saw great streams of yellow pollen sweeping by on the wind, every speck filled with information. Blueprints for making perfect blue flowers, the dark musculature of trees, meadow grasses. I saw in that moment that the whole sky is filled with furtive transmissions. Pollen and seeds, radio waves and subatomic particles, the songs of birds, satellite broadcasts of the 6 o'clock news and the home shopping network. And I saw that what is necessary to make substance or meaning out of any of it is a receiver, somebody to receive. Years later, struggling to make sense of a stunning aggregate of symptoms and synchronicities in my life that appeared to cluster around the question of whether or not I should leave a job, I realized that my own life was similarly flooded with signals of which I was only dimly aware, but that seemed to indicate the necessary steps I should take to make my life literally come true. Until then, unfortunately, the receiver had usually been turned off, so these incoming calls fell lemming-like into silence. In many traditions, calls in the form of sounds precede prayer, rites of initiation, spiritual healings, and major life events. The purpose of calls is to summon adherents away from their daily grinds to a new level of awareness, into communion with that which is bigger than themselves. The calls may come from bull roarers, trumpets, rattles, wooden clackers, songs, bells, or the chanting of criers atop the minarets. In the primary creation myth of Western cosmology, the very first call came through the voice that said, "Let there be light," and there was light, the words becoming flesh. Every call since then has also been a call to form, a call to each of us to materialize ourselves. Calls, of course, beg the question who, or what, is calling. But in attempting to answer this question, even an exhaustive list of every name for soul or destiny or God would be beside the point. It simply doesn't matter whether we call it God, the patterning intelligence, or simply life's longing for itself, as Khalil Gibran envisioned. It is clear, however, that living means being addressed, as theologian Martin Buber once said, and whatever or whoever is addressing us is a power like wind or fusion or faith. We can't see the force, but we can see what it does. Primarily, this force announces the need for change, and the response called for is an awakening of some kind. A call is only a monologue. A return call, a response, creates a dialogue. Our own unfolding requires that we be in constant dialogue with whatever is calling us. The call and one's response to it are also a central metaphor for the spiritual life, and in Latin there is even a correspondence between the words for listening and following. This tape, then, is about putting on a lens through which we can see our lives as a process of calls and responses. To me, this is a much more appealing and meaningful approach than, as I heard a character on television remark recently, seeing life as just a bunch of stuff that happens. This tape is also about religion in the original sense of the word, the Latin religare, to reconnect, to remember what has been dismembered, our own selves, the deep life within us that is a strong religious impulse despite whatever outward waywardness our lives may exhibit. The call to attention. By turning on our devoted attention, by becoming students of our lives, archivists of its details, we can distinguish the calls that are sweeping by us constantly, obscured by our inattention. If we don't listen, the callings go unnoticed, and we are the worse for it. Our lives become absurd, absurdus, meaning to be absolutely deaf. Aspire then to be like a good animal, on the alert, or like someone in love. As theologian Paul Tillich once said, the first duty of love is to listen. Furthermore, if you sense that the world is animated by a loving presence, and your own life is somehow witnessed, you listen back in the spirit of conversation, appreciation, courtesy. If you don't sense the world to be animated by a loving presence, if, like the ancient Greeks perhaps, you sense it animated by gods who've become mean-spirited with boredom, who have taken to messing with the mortals' minds to relieve the ennui born of immortality, then you listen in the spirit of self-defense. Either way, listening is hard work. But the discipline of paying close attention to ourselves, to the vital signs that blip across the screen of our lives in forms such as dreams, intuitions, feedback, and longings, will help us know what our calls are. This practice of listening will tell us what's true and what's not, when to proceed and when to postpone, whom to trust and whom not, which direction to take at the crossroads, whose voices are brawling in our heads, what's right for us and where we're willing to be led. Part of this discipline is being willing to contend with what we hear when we turn on our receivers. By being willing to receive, we in a sense will the calls to happen, to make themselves known. We draw them to us. But we never quite know what kind of marching orders we're going to get. We may not be entirely happy with them, though happiness isn't the point. Following is. We're on a scavenger hunt, tracking, searching for arrowheads. When we find them, we turn them over and over in the warm, expectant tremble of our hands, rubbing them as if they might be magic lamps, which they might be. Certain tribes of South Pacific Islanders can sail for 1,000 miles over open ocean under complete cloud cover, with no sun, moon, or stars to usher them from island to island, and yet know exactly where they are by the kinds of waves beneath their rafts. This is a hard act to follow, but those who are the most attuned to their callings aspire to just this quality of mindfulness. With senses adequate to their potential and to the passions they feel, they try to make their way, listening, as social activist Fran Peavy puts it, as if there's a thief in the house. Gordon Hempton is one such person, and as what he calls a sound tracker, he operates on this level of subtlety, earning his living by recording the vanishing sounds of nature. He wasn't always this way. In fact, for many years, he had a hard time even keeping himself among the living, due to his inattention in a line of work that has little mercy for such lapses. He was a bike messenger in Seattle. For 7 years, it was a way to support his true love, recording nature sounds. Because he tended to pay more attention out in the field than on the job, Gordon found himself bloodied up in more than a few run-ins with automobiles. These encounters, though, did wonders for his hearing. I learned that these ears, he said, are hanging onto my head for more than just listening to the radio. They're the watchdogs of my life, my guidance system, and I now use them as if my life depended on it. Biking eventually became for him, of necessity, a kind of mindfulness practice, the exercise of keeping his receivers turned on to the subtleties in and around him. And one bright sunrise, biking up a steep hill, he was struck again, this time by a call, to follow dawn, as he put it, around the world, recording the sounds of nature. It took another year of planning, $15,000 out of his own pocket, and 4 months of traveling, but it also became an Emmy Award-winning PBS documentary called The Vanishing Dawn Chorus, which took him 70,000 miles around the globe, tracking, as he wrote in a grant proposal for the project, a never-ending wave of birdsong that follows the rhythm of the Earth's rotation as if the sun never stopped rising and the birds never stopped singing. Gordon now possesses what the Eskimos call siyukatat, the ear of the animal. He can listen to a recording of wind in the pines and tell you the length of the pine needles. He can hear the sound of water running underground. He will tell you that quiet places, including those on the inside of us, are the think tanks of the soul. And he will tell you that having the ear of the animal has more than once saved not only his soul, but his skin. We have to be open to hearing things we may not want to hear, though, he says. Suffering as well as passion. In following the call I heard telling me I had to be a sound tracker, I had to be willing to inflict economic hardship on my family. In 15 years, there have been times I deeply regretted becoming a listener, and I put my equipment up for sale. But that was harder than the economic hardship, and I always kept going. Besides, what kind of example would I be setting for my kids? Tuning out the call is the real risk. A full listener has to be willing to hear it all. Attention must be paid, cried Willie Loman at the end of Death of a Salesman, and found out too late that he hadn't. According to those I interviewed for this tape, people who are very responsive to their callings, any practice that strengthens our powers of observation and our ability to see subtleties within ourselves, any practice that allows us to step outside and look back through the shop window, will help us overcome what mythologist Joseph Campbell considered the great sacrilege in terms of the soul's integrity, that of inadvertence, of not being alert, not being awake. These practices include anything that helps us pay attention to our lives, such as keeping a daily journal, meditation, therapy, artwork, movement work, martial arts, dream interpretation, music, long walks, intimate conversation, retreats, fasting, rituals. These practices also remind us not to spend so much time awaiting big booming voices from on high that we stumble over the whispers that are right at our feet. If you listen down below, instructs the Torah, you will deserve to hear from above. But start small, says psychologist Charles Tart in his book Waking Up, lest you overwhelm yourself with your psychic revelations. Observe yourself walking and eating first. Watch yourself working, thinking about your future, talking to your parents. Then move up, or rather inward, to observing your dreams, physical symptoms, spiritual conundrums, loves and hates. Self-awareness also requires that we have curiosity about ourselves, Tart says. We need to resurrect the sort of basic inquisitiveness we had as children, that we usually directed outward, the curiosity that had us down on our knees staring into puddles looking for upside-down worlds, pulling seeds apart to figure out how a tree could possibly fit in there, and asking why. Remember to start small. Just observe it first. Don't analyze. Use curiosity, not interrogation. Save that for later. Just as we get better mileage when we separate the creative and critical functions in our attempts to write or paint or invent, so too we make self-awareness more palatable by holding off the impulse to be critical, so that we focus initially on the desire simply to see. Observation in itself will be considered an intrusion by those undiscovered parts of us that would prefer to remain that way. Keep in mind that the laws of cause and effect are not so strict that merely thinking about a thing automatically brings it into being. And promise yourself that you don't have to do anything about what you find with your curiosity. I used to think of Sisyphus as the patron saint of workaholics, one of whom I somewhat provisionally consider myself to be, though more out of necessity than compulsion. Freelance writing is a heavy stone and demands a steady labor to keep it rolling. Until recently, though, I'd overlooked the true instruction of Sisyphus's life, which is that each time his grindstone rolls to the bottom of the mountain, he's granted a rest, while he walks back down to retrieve it. Though he must work for all time according to the myth, he doesn't work all the time. Nor, I decided a few years ago, should I. Having just completed a book that took me 15 months of 12-hour days, I suddenly hit a wall I had never hit in my life as a working man: burnout. The thought of doing another day's work on anything even remotely related to the machinations of building a career, producing income, or generally getting ahead was nearly enough to buckle me at the knees. As it was, in the waning days of the book project, I pulled myself up to my desk each morning as if to a chin-up bar. After such an intemperance of work, no trip seemed too extravagant or protracted, no binge too vulgar, no amount of goofing off too unreasonable. So I decided to take a break. In fact, I decided to extend the spirit of Sabbath to outlandish proportions by taking 4 months off, living off savings, and for a brief period in the middle of my life, seeing what it would feel like simply not to work. I wanted to make time for the kind of creative idleness that an acquaintance of mine calls power lounging. I needed space, distance from all that was pressing in on me. I needed a penetrating quiet inside, and I needed to hold that silence up to my ears like an empty shell and listen to the roar of my own life. I had to try to make out what direction to take next. When I told a colleague what I planned to do now that the book was done, he asked, "What are you, rich?" "No," I replied. "Desperate." Often the best bait to use in luring a call is a little space. Time when we're not giving off only busy signals, because then calls can't get through. But this is far easier said than done. Whenever I assumed an angle of repose or attempted to quiet my mind or understand how it worked, I immediately noticed how much it behaved like a room full of toddlers. This was brought home to me particularly in the first phase of my vocational celibacy, when I suffered depression. A big project and a lifetime of work build up a tremendous momentum that doesn't end just because the work does. As in a head-on collision, the car stops, but the passenger doesn't. For my entire leave of absence, I experienced a bewildering freedom marked by a maddening restlessness that routinely propelled me, despite my intentions, back into my office as if I were in a trance. I would sit there sometimes for hours, twisting back and forth on my chair, pulling at my lower lip, listening to the blathering traffic of noises in my head, while my legs vibrated like tuning forks under the desk. I began to realize with crackling clarity during this supposed time off that I come from a long line of doers, starting with a workaholic family who had hardwired me to excel, to stay on top of things, to expect that hard work and material wealth would put me in line to receive the key to the cosmic washroom. On his deathbed, my grandfather asked my mother what day it was. "Tuesday," she said. "Pay the gardener," he instructed her. His obituary was like most others, betraying the compulsive preoccupation with work and helping me understand why I had such a devil of a time not working. Obits are little more than posthumous resumes, lists of accomplishments, books authored, titles held, military ranks attained, degrees earned. They're summary statements of our lives, testaments to what we hold in esteem. There are no hallelujahs for idleness, for time spent with family or on retreat, for afternoons given over to long, dreamy walks, for time spent in a state of being rather than a state of doing. Listening is a state of being, but droning away in the boiler room of the culture is a juggernaut of a machine that heaves out a message strong enough to pump cement through the pipes. Work. Value adheres to what we produce, so we're constantly doing. When we're busy doing, we don't have to be busy feeling. Feeling that maybe we're burned out, pinned to the ground by the gravity of our endeavors, that we need a change, or that working, which normally offers us a sense of control over our lives, has instead made our lives feel like a parody of being in control, like we're frantically trying to shovel coal into a furnace that's burning it up faster and faster. Having your nose to the grindstone, your shoulder to the wheel, and your back to the wall for long periods of time is simply not the most comfortable position. Sometimes lying in the bathtub is. By adopting postures of receptivity in relation to whatever shy thing hankers for our attention, we build an entryway for it. We clear a strip in the jungle for the planes to land. We come to understand the irony that we can experience progress even while standing still, that going inward can be going forward. Sitting quietly for even a few minutes a day gives us a place in which to catch our breath, a chance for our callings and intuitions to catch up with us, an eddy into which we can turn our canoe from the current. In the beginning was the Word, and that Word grew out of silence. So, to the degree we're each waiting for word of our callings, we ought to tend the soil of silence. We need to teach ourselves to sit quietly and listen, just listen, long enough to leave a decent indentation on the couch. If all our moments are filled with words and thoughts, with noise however joyous, then when it comes time to convey our deepest intuitions, when our lives demand guidance from within, we'll be speechless. Thomas Merton once remarked that in considering any important decision in life, it's imperative to consult your death. Because, as the English writer Samuel Johnson once put it, when a man knows he is to be hanged in a fortnight, it concentrates his mind wonderfully. Death is a strip search. It points the barrel of mortality at your head and demands to see what you have hidden under your garments. It also asks the question, what do you love? As you listen for callings, keep such a question poised in your mind. It may help tune out some of the static. In fact, what do you love is the question that callings pose. Many years ago, I interviewed a number of people who were forced to consult their deaths because their doctors had told them that they were dying. A few of them were shattered by the news, but most were liberated. They spoke about feeling no longer trapped by life, feeling free to speak their minds and follow their hearts, free from imaginary fears, tyrannical conformities and pleasantries, and petty authorities. One woman told me that her cancer diagnosis was not a death sentence, but a life sentence. She no longer wondered how to spend her precious nick of time. Her passions and loves were finally released. I personally visit ruins whenever I can. When I travel, I prefer going to places where they abound. The crumbling walls of stone fortresses still bearing the scars of cannonballs, the remains of mummies blown out of the sand by the wind, the broken rim of a volcano whose eruption destroyed an entire civilization. Anything to remind me that every castle, like the sun, goes down. I remember my father telling me once of hosting a friend from Europe, who laughed at him when, with great enthusiasm, he led him through some New England woods to the site of an old log cabin from the 1800s. "That's no ruin," his friend scoffed. "A mere 100 years old. People live that long." Ruins, he said, have to remind you that all your greatest efforts, All the greatest efforts of even hundreds of generations of men and women, thousands of years of human history, will yield nothing absolute, nothing that will last, and that the great thing, the real accomplishment, is building your house in full view of the volcano. The challenge of finding clarity. There is no checklist against which we can test our callings with dead reckoning, much as we might desire it. No list of ingredients for a true call. We can only try to make sense of signs by drawing lines between them, connecting the dots so that a form, a pattern, a rough road map emerges. The truest calls seem not only to keep coming back, but also to make their way to us through many different channels, so we can use this as a starting point. Make a tally of the signals you've been receiving around any given issue, through dreams, fantasies, cravings and ambitions, persistent symptoms, the fears and resistances that have been preoccupying you lately, any opportunity whose sudden appearance in your life borders on synchronicity, whatever people have been telling you a lot lately, what books are on your nightstand, what notes to yourself are tacked onto fruit magnets on the refrigerator door. Then do the mathematics. What, if anything, do these all add up to? As you seek to discern your callings, it might help to define what you look for in a calling, to test whether it's the genuine article, to come up with something of a portrait, a mugshot of your calling. Think back on previous calls that panned out and list them. The job you knew you should quit and you were right. The relationship you waffled about committing to until you wore holes in your shoes, but you finally said yes and it turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to you. The time you took a moral stand and felt tremendously empowered. The point is, how did it feel to act on a calling? Did you feel more awake? Was there a kind of rightness to your actions? Did you experience a flood of energy? Did you discover you had surprising forbearance for the mundane tasks involved in the undertaking, and that after a month or a year your enthusiasm didn't falter? Did you feel gratitude? Did you experience gales of resistance to committing, which may be an indication of the importance of a call? Did your friends declare that they haven't seen you so excited in a long time? While you're at it, list those calls that didn't pan out and their attending signals. The most critical discernment skill, M. Scott Peck, author of The Road Less Traveled, insists, is being able to distinguish between the sound of integrity and the sound of its absence. In order to recognize a true call, you must be able to recognize a false one, just as in order to spot a truth, you must be able to spot a lie. Keep in mind that if a pursuit does not strike oil, it doesn't mean your effort lacked integrity or value. Perhaps you were meant to try something and find it not to your liking, so that you could cross it off your list once and for all. It's important to know what you don't want, too. Maybe your failures are actually the path itself. How do you know, for instance, that the hit-and-run nature of your love life isn't part of the unfolding of something you can't even fathom at the moment? Maybe you're called to continue leaving relationships because you're going to be a marriage counselor someday, and this is part of your training. It is not uncommon to hear people say, if you told me that 5 years from now I would be a marriage counselor, or a full-time artist, a father, living in Europe, not painting anymore, fill in the blank, I would have told you you were out of your mind. In his autobiography, Nikos Kazantzakis, author of Zorba the Greek, described an incident in which he came upon a cocoon cradled in the bark of an olive tree, just as the butterfly was making a hole and attempting to emerge. Impatient for results, he bent over it and warmed it under his breath, by which he succeeded in speeding up the process. The butterfly, however, emerged prematurely, its wings hopelessly crumpled and stuck to its own body, which needed the sun's patient warmth, not the man's impertinent breath, to transform it. Moments later, after a desperate struggle, the butterfly died in the palm of his hand. That little body, he wrote toward the end of his life, is the greatest weight I have on my conscience. Patience is the missing link in the discernment process, in the search for clarity of calling and readiness of heart, and in the waiting for events to unfurl and talents to ripen. These things seldom burst into being all at once. They accrete like the shells of oysters, bubble up and cool like lava, adding layer by layer onto the armature of themselves. Drumming our fingers won't make events move any faster. We suffer from the cultural misapprehension that waiting means doing nothing. Great fanfare, for example, usually attends the moment of inspiration, the aha, the eureka, Sir Isaac Newton's revelation upon the apple, Archimedes' bathtub epiphany about specific gravity, Samuel Coleridge's epic poem Kubla Khan, which is said to have popped into his consciousness whole. Little notice, however, is taken of the usually lengthy period that precedes it, the period of observation, meditation, experiment, uncertainty, frustration, fits and starts. The period of asking the questions over and over, of sleeping on it and pitching in our sleep. We love the answers and suffer the questions. We worship the flower and ignore the soil. We covet the diamond and overlook the pressure it took to make it. Far from being the transcendent experience we imagine, though, this hero or heroine's journey, this search for what is truest in ourselves, turns out to be largely pick and shovel work. Time in itself won't suffice, though, because the discernment process isn't just about being patient, but about being actively patient, using the time we have to submit the evidence we gather to the compassionate scrutiny of the mind, the adjudication of the heart, the gut reaction of the body. It is about taking up the pickaxe and digging, chipping away a bit at a time at our stony questions, or feeling our way like a bird that travels for thousands of miles guided only by instinct and the whisper of magnetism. There is such a thing as thinking too much about a calling, however, which is like leaving a hot iron too long in one place while you're trying to smooth the wrinkles out of your shirt. Studying it to death, turning it inside out like an old sock rather than to some degree simply exposing yourself before it, can not only make it go bony with refusal, but can also be a pretty good way of avoiding the call altogether. We can analyze every facet of it. We can probe every consequence of following it, not following it, procrastinating in following it, jumping on it right away or trading it in for another. We can ponder whether it's really ours or whether we're appropriating someone else's, whether the time is now or later, whether it's being murmured to us by God or not God. We can hold off and then beat ourselves up for not taking action, or we can take action and beat ourselves up for not being more patient. We can scare the backbone out of ourselves by contemplating the enormity of the call and the modest talents we bring to bear on it. We can break ourselves against the rock of debate. We can think too much, which is something Dante and his guide Virgil discovered on their outing to the Inferno. They were not permitted to pass through one particular threshold until they left all reason and intellect behind. These faculties are useful, in other words, but only up to a point. Beyond that, the door will be barred to us if we attempt to cross by way of reason. Beyond a certain point, faith is the magic lamp and humility the abracadabra. Faith begins, if it begins at all, where knowledge leaves off. Even scientists will admit that they do all the homework they can, but eventually rely on an intuitive leap. They call it informed intuition, and though it grows naturally out of periods of dogged rational work, which provides the raw material it needs to go on, reason again only goes so far. Intuition is the last baton carrier. It doesn't win the race alone, but it's the one that crosses the finish line. The more practiced it is, the less likely it is to get winded at crucial moments. Practicing intuition is ironically best accomplished the scientific way. Test and observe. Keep a record of your hunches over a period of time and see how often they're accurate. If you feel you're meant to work with someone, to accept an invitation by a stranger, to slow down as you approach a particular intersection, to encourage your child in a certain direction, to intervene in a situation or bite your tongue, to make a move or stay put, try it out and document the results. With enough practice, when intuition finally tips the scales in favor of following a calling, precisely because you have devoted time to practicing it, you will know that just a feeling now carries a weight of authority you can trust. Still, a calling is ultimately mysterious, and the process of discernment is always a bit of a guessing game. In Greek, the word mystery means to close the mouth, which, says Lewis Hyde in his book The Gift, may refer to the secrecy to which initiates into ancient mysteries were sworn. It may also refer to the belief that ultimately a mystery could not be spoken of or fully explained. Shown, witnessed, revealed, says Hyde, but not explained. Braving conflict. F. Scott Fitzgerald once declared that the test of a first-rate intelligence is being able to hold two contrary ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. William Went is someone Fitzgerald would have liked. An Episcopalian minister in Washington, D.C., He was possessed in 1975 of the unpopular clerical notion that women had as much right to be priests as men did. This sentiment was not shared by his bishops, nor by his religion, which held to the dubious logic that women could not be priests for the simple reason that they never had been. None of the 12 apostles had been a woman. One day, after great deliberation, and with his conviction that sometimes it's easier to seek forgiveness than permission, he invited a woman who had been illicitly ordained by an insurgent bishop in Philadelphia up to the altar to celebrate Mass. For this breach in the pecking order, he was summarily tried by the Church, in the equivalent of a grand jury trial in civil law, for violating the vow of obedience to the godly admonitions of the bishop, as Church canon puts it. The call to take action, to make a statement of some kind, if not in word, then in deed, prompted a considerable debate in his own mind, Reverend Wentz said, which revolved around the question of whether ultimate authority for his conscience and his actions lay with God or with the bishops. He prayed for clarity and took solo retreats in search of guidance to resolve these two competing inclinations. His priestly vows and a 2,000-year-old tradition required that he honor the laws of the Church through which he had been able to conduct his life's work. The imperatives of his conscience, however, as author H.L. Mencken described it, the inner voice that warns us someone may be looking, required that he honor what he felt was God and God's authority. Reverend Went eventually decided that ultimate authority lay, as he described it, with God and not with the bishops, and that his path lay in upholding the rights of people. He was willing to endure conflict, both within himself and between him and his superiors, in order to honor a calling, rather than avoid contrariety just for its sedative effect. Furthermore, he felt this decision did nothing to undermine his commitment to the Bible, which instructed him to consult the highest authority in matters of conscience. An individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust, said Martin Luther King Jr., with whom Reverend Went worked in the 60s during the Civil Rights Movement, and who willingly accepts the penalty in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law. The Church, however, didn't agree. Over the next several weeks, with lawyers on both sides quoting from the Bible, William Wentz stood trial for insubordination. He was eventually found guilty and censured, and lost again on appeal. By that time, however, publicity had begun to turn the tide in his favor, and 2 years after his original trial, at the General Convention of the Episcopal Church, the very same bishops relented in the face of rising opposition, and probably the dictates of public relations, and granted women access to the altar. Today, largely because of William Went, more than a third of the Episcopal clergy is female, and though he no longer works at his old parish, St. Stephen's, fittingly the Church's first martyr, the new priest there is a priestess. Also because of him, the Episcopal Church now has what it calls the rule of conscience, which states that conscience is acceptable grounds on which a priest can make a decision. A heroic quality of intelligence is required in the face of a calling, which flings often opposing energies into our lives. One part of us wants to awaken, another to sleep. One part of us wants to follow, another wants to run like hell. One part may be certain of a call by way of inner knowing, while another is completely dumbstruck in terms of objective proof. We understand the call psychologically, but not logically. One part of us may feel it's chosen, and another that it's ordained. We may feel the forces of both impulsiveness and caution, of idealism joined at the hip with cynicism. We may feel we have to do the irrational to bring some rationale to our lives. It's absurd to pursue your art, the painter Willem de Kooning once said, but it's absurd not to. When we stretch our arms to reach for anything, some muscles contract and some expand. Sometimes these contrary exertions inside us feel like gladiators tied together for a fight to the finish, and sometimes like the swimming bodies of yin and yang swirling around in the same fishbowl. Either way, the opposing forces occupy a space like an ecotone, a transition zone between two ecological communities like forest and grassland, or river and desert. They compete, yes, but they also exchange, swapping juices, information, and resources. Ecotones have tremendous biological diversity and resilience. Psychologist Robert Johnson speaks of the ground between conflicting forces as a holy place. Heresy, he says, is giving domination to one principle over all others. When the unstoppable bullet hits the impenetrable wall, he writes in his book Transformation, we find the religious experience. It is precisely here that one will grow. Conflict to paradox to revelation. This is the divine progression. What then is unstoppable in you? And what is your impenetrable wall? According to Johnson, by witnessing their collision in full consciousness, by juggling them both without allowing one or the other to fall between the floorboards, we reconcile ourselves. We exercise first-rate intelligence. Let's say you feel called to bring more creativity and freedom into your life in the form of starting up a new business. Just the thought of this will probably send the gladiators of head and heart strutting into the arena. Your head will ask, have you taken a look at your savings account lately? The thing's all skin and bones, and that's with a regular paycheck. The heart will cry, I want out. I want some of the creativity I left back in college. I want to live in California by the sea. I want to be my own boss. I want to do the brave thing, do something for love. Where would the world be if all its heroes followed the bottom line? Where would you be if, just to be rid of the tension, you ignored one or the other of these voices? If you barred the door to what is, after all, a part of yourself? What does experience tell you typically ensues if you don't let them both have a say? How did you feel, for instance, when your parents only listened to your brother's side of the story in an argument? The gods are no less fussy. They gave us head and heart and the ears with which to hear them. Who wants to insult the powers that hand out callings? We need to learn to allow the tensions between head and heart to hammer out a compromise, meaning a promise together. Perhaps you tighten the budget and work for another year to build up the money to leave sooner, or borrow. You move to a city in California where the business opportunities are good. You take the company you work for as your first client. You come up with a plan B, just in case. You surround yourself with people who are working on dreams of their own. In other words, you encourage head and heart to meet at the bargaining table, not to retreat to their respective ramparts. There is a big difference between being divided within ourselves and being divided against ourselves. The former expresses the creative suffering of paradox. The latter expresses only paralysis. One happens quite seldom, the other quite often. Jean Knudsen Hoffman sees it most abundantly in the tendency toward enemy-making in the world, the tragic inability of people and groups of people to manage the differences between them. For this reason, among others, in 1952, she was called to join the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the oldest interfaith pacifist organization in the world, which is comprised of thousands of citizen diplomats. Through the fellowship, she has traveled from her Santa Barbara home to Russia, Libya, and the Middle East, primarily in order to listen to the grievances of those whom we as Americans call our enemies. My mother used to take me to all kinds of different churches while I was growing up, she says. And she told me there was truth in all of them, and it was up to me to find it. In her travels, she discovered that there is no one truth. There are only stories. If each side, she said, can listen to the stories of the other, the suffering of the other, the history of the other, reconciliation is made much easier. The Way of Passion. Maurice Sendak, author of Where the Wild Things Are, once recounted that he sent to a young reader a card on which he drew a wild thing. The boy's mother wrote back that her son loved the card so much he ate it. He didn't seem to care that it was an original Maurice Sendak drawing. He just saw it, he loved it, he ate it. Passion is a state of love and hunger. It is also a state of enthusiasm, which means to be possessed by a god or a goddess, by a wild thing. One could be possessed by the god of poetry or the goddess of animals, the god of commerce or the goddess of home and hearth. If we imagine that calls issue from the gods, then we are as close as we ever get to them, the calls and the gods, when we are enthusiastic. We move toward a kind of divine presence because through our passions we are utterly present. We are utterly charged and focused. We are oblivious. We forget ourselves, our troubles, our day-to-day living on Mulberry Street lives. We hitch ourselves to something bigger. Mark Dubois once asked a friend of his, a city planner who worked as an environmentalist in Mikhail Gorbachev's government, how they could get more people involved in saving the environment. First, his friend responded, I think it is important that one fall in love. At age 16, Mark Dubois had fallen in love with a river. That river, the Stanislaus in Northern California, became a passion that would lead him to places he never imagined he would go. Tradition has it that our gifts and our talents are the most likely places to find callings, which is largely true, but not always. Sometimes we're called toward arenas in which we seem to have scant abilities, little experience or know-how. Sometimes we're called toward things to which we have distinct aversions, or toward what we have always thought of as our weaknesses, whether it's leadership, public speaking, or the practice of compassion for some group we were taught to despise. A passion is not necessarily a talent, or vice versa, however, and there's no telling where it may lead. It struck Mark as bizarre, for instance, that he, always a loner, who preferred the backwaters to the mainstreams, would be called to become an environmental activist, a river politician, to come down from the mountains into Sacramento where the decisions are made, and add his voice to the public debate, to widen his field of affections to include, as he puts it, everything in the universe. But the river called him, he says, to go out and defend its honor. Mark was a river guide on the Stanislaus, writing the occasional letter to his congressman about the new Maloney's Dam, which was slated to turn the river into a reservoir, when a friend asked if he would head up the Sacramento campaign to save it. His initial reaction was something along the lines of, "Who, me?" "I thought I can barely coordinate myself," he said, no less a political campaign. But at one time, he says, sports had not been his forte either, and now he was a river guide. So Mark agreed to lead the campaign, and what was supposed to be a commitment of a few hours a week turned into a 24-hour-a-day passion. I was called to give far more of myself than I ever imagined I could give. The river, however, had given him much, he says. His first passion, confidence, connection to his own emotions, a sense of priorities, a job, freedom from fear. And his environmental enthusiasm has been a kind of payback, a matter of returning the favor. The river also continues to give him much, helping propel him through the struggles and misgivings involved in politics by providing him, he says, with countless analogies. It's taught me not to panic when there are sharp rocks, that the current dances past them, and it's the same in politics. I've learned how to dance past the old curmudgeons, not to get hung up on the rocks. It's also taught me how to look way downstream to figure out where the currents and channels are, so I don't have to work as hard at the last minute or get bounced around so much. And when the river rips an oar out of your hand, you don't get mad. The river brings you back to attention. It's very similar in the human arena, though humans are much harder. Perhaps the river even prepared him for what he felt called to do on its behalf some years down the road, which was to sacrifice his life. In the spring of 1979, the new Maloney's Dam was completed, and the engineers and politicians gave their word to the environmentalists that they would honor the law and fill it no higher than an old bridge at a place called Parrott's Ferry, the Stanislaus Canyon. Through the early months of '79, as the water was slowly rising, Friends of the River, which Mark had co-founded, began a series of witness encampments, where people could take their last look at the meadows, beaches, archaeological sites, and waterways they loved. Then word got out that the engineers were going to let the water rise well past Parrott's Ferry, and the environmentalists cried foul. The engineers said, in effect, tough. This is when Mark made a decision that the time had come to draw a line in the sand, to make a personal statement about his feelings both for the river and about the efforts to destroy it. For over 5 years, every legal and political string had been pulled on behalf of the Stanislaus, and for him it came down to this. He wrote a letter to the Corps of Engineers, with copies going to the White House and various state and federal offices. He said, "I plan to have my feet permanently anchored to a rock in the canyon at the elevation of Parrott's Ferry the day the water reaches that elevation. I urge you to do all in your power to prevent the flooding of the canyon above Parrott's Ferry." On the appointed day, not unaware of the terrible irony of possibly being killed by the very river that had called him, he kayaked to a remote spot on the rising reservoir, weeping much of the way there, not out of fear, but grief, and chained himself to a large boulder, having first hidden a key well out of reach. He had only a sleeping bag, a poncho, some books, and a cup to scoop water from the reservoir, which was only 2 feet below his perch and rising. Mark told only one friend, dubbed Deep Paddle, where he was so that he could bring him news. Mark told him that if the water reached his knees, not to come back. The water never did get to his knees. The politicians got to theirs first, and the water began to level off. But Mark only told Deep Paddle the whereabouts of the key when he had written assurance that the water wouldn't begin to rise again once he had come out. Today, Mark is director of Worldwise, a grassroots campaign to ensure the environmental, social, and economic sustainability of multilateral bank loans. The fact that again he appears ill-suited to the task hasn't stopped him from contending with the grand moguls of global finance like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. One thing I've learned, he says, is that of all the horrendous problems we face in the world, one strikes me as the root cause of them all, and it's a myth. I don't have any power. Passion is power. On the color spectrum from faint interest to rabid obsession, it is toward the red end of the continuum. It is the smelling salts of the soul. The author Annie Dillard once wrote that the thing is to stalk your calling in a certain skilled and supple way, to locate the live spot and plug into that pulse. Sometimes, of course, it's painful to admit a passion, because we may feel we can't do anything about it. We can't afford to go sailing, don't have the freedom to travel, no time to read books. Our lack of choices is too depressing to think about, so we don't. Maybe we're playing all or nothing, afraid that if we get an inch, we'll demand a mile, rather than allowing some of it in our lives, just a little, right now. But the point of passion is mainly to follow, to let yourself love what you love, to respect your hunger and obey your thirst. The power of dreams. Dreams bubble up from the unconscious, which seems to contain an image of the way we're supposed to be, and works toward the expression of this potential the way a sculptor works toward releasing the statue held inside a rock. To ignore dreams is to hide the sculptor's tools, to tear out pages from our own stories, to drive with our tailpipes dragging on the ground. If we ignore dreams, we cut ourselves off from that place from which calls emanate. Dreams tell us how we really feel about something. They help us fine-tune our direction and ascertain our calls, show us our unfinished business, and remind us how much bigger our lives are than what we know consciously. In fact, dreams show us that consciousness itself is a scrabbling around at the hem of something so big it would short us out if we understood its true dimensions. I sometimes wonder, if I can possess such immense powers in my dreams, might I similarly possess powers beyond my imagination in my waking life? Dreaming is about waking up. The unconscious often knows things we don't, things that in the broad daylight of consciousness remain invisible to us, just as the stars play to an empty house during the day when the sun is shining. Some things can only be seen when it's dark. Trying to solve our problems or make our way or get a grip on our priorities without the information that dreams provide, says Anne Faraday in The Dream Game, is like a detective with only half the facts of a case. In the weeks prior to losing a job early in my journalism career, one I was hanging on to primarily for the security and status, my dreams were splitting at the seams with portents of how I really felt about trading off integrity for comfort and a dollop of renown. Although I faithfully recorded them in my dream journal, I did absolutely nothing about interpreting them, and with good reason. It would have been like standing up in a canoe. In one dream, I was handed a stack of $100 bills, and later discovered that I'd been cheated. Only the top bill was a 100, the rest were ones. In another, I was invited to the boss's estate for an extravagant pool party, but the pool was empty. Now this is not, as they say, rocket science. I was being invited to take a good look at what I was doing at that job and how I felt about being there. But because I didn't want to look, I was completely shocked when I suddenly lost the job. The official reason appropriately was, there isn't a fit. I shouldn't have been so surprised. As if to confirm the validity, the rightness of both the dreams and the eventual outcome, fate topped them off with an astonishing synchronicity. The Monday following my Friday dismissal from the job, I was supposed to interview the author of a book called Starting Over: How to Survive the Loss of a Job. That book was sitting on my night table when I got home, since I had planned to read it over the weekend. Needless to say, I did. Members of a tribe in Malaysia called the Sonoy put great stock in their dreams and gather each morning to share them. When they dream of being chased, they assume that whatever is chasing them is an ally rather than an enemy. So they turn and face their pursuer to inquire what the chase is all about, what the message might be that the pursuer bears. This is the heart of dream work, of revealing the nature of the calls whose fins break the surface in our dreams, of deciphering the messages they bring. The challenge lies in turning around and facing whatever is there rather than running from it. It's like being chased by a dog, or a bear, or a big cat. The general rule is, don't run. If you run from them, they tend to consider you to be food, which could lead to a fatal case of mistaken identity. If you're courageous enough to turn and face your pursuers, you're probably also strong enough not to get devoured by them. But you've got to be willing to boogie with the boogeyman. It takes some nerve to study your dreams, the same nerve it takes to examine a firecracker that didn't go off. This certainly helps explain why dream recall is such a slippery affair. A part of us doesn't want to remember them because of the messages they bear, the things they reveal, the directions they point us. The truth may set you free, but there's an even chance that first it will scare the daylights out of you. Dreams respond not only to the amount of interest we pay them, but also to direct requests. You can draw them to you by petition. You can bargain with them. If you get in the habit of asking for dream guidance as you're dropping off to sleep, the minions of Morpheus will fairly beat a path to your door. Just be prepared to take dictation. Keep a pad and pen by the bedside. Promise the spirits that if they send you a dream, you'll write it down upon waking, even if that's at 3 a.m. Prompt them with specific questions. Ask for directions. Ask for clues. Ask what your next step should be. Ask for clarification of last night's dream. Just get to your dreams before the world does. Write them down before you even get out of bed, because the moment your feet hit the floor, you ground yourself, and the lightning energy of dreams disappears into the earth. The moment of awakening is make or break time in dream recall, and some finesse is in order. A dream is made of spider webbing. It tatters easily. So when you awaken, move as if you are paddling a canoe on a glassy lake, or walking across a room carrying brimming teacups. As for the dream material itself, some of it is like junk mail. Only a small percentage is truly useful and worth slogging through. Some of it also comes in such a crazy mambo of images, vignettes, metaphors, and other psychic ephemera that trying to make any sense of it is like running down the street trying to grab the loose papers of a manuscript the wind has snatched out of your hands. After you have something in writing that seems gainful, however, don't necessarily run with the first interpretation that comes to you. Brainstorm all associations you can conjure about the dream images or events, especially the most potent one in the dream. What words, ideas, people, memories, and feelings does it remind you of? Go with the one that elicits the most energy. Since most dreams, though not all, seem to relate to something happening in present time, ask how the dream ties into your life right now. Where have you seen this particular scenario playing itself out lately? What is it trying to tell you? What is its central message? Ask how various dreams of flying, falling, conquering foes, being unable to find something, having extraordinary powers, of being chased, may be symbolic of aspects of your life. Before you settle on an interpretation, though, check the physical world first. If you dream your car loses its brakes, check your brakes. If nothing shows up, check where in your life you perhaps feel unable to stop or out of control. If you dream someone you know is dying and they're not, then ask what this person represents to you. Integrity, innocence, humor, playfulness, and thus what in your own life or personality may be dying. The turn of events. One of the shining qualities that heroes possess is the willingness to be educated by all things. They learn from the most impressive variety of people and experiences, the wise and the foolish, the obvious and the inconceivable, the living and the dead, the things they love and the things they hate, children and animals and the voluble energetics of nature, all the thumpings and all the bounties they earn from the world. Heroic people also understand that calls are not just inner experiences, passions, dreams, symptoms, but also outer. These come to us from the world and from the events in our lives, and whether they fling themselves at us like fastballs or follow us around and rub up against us like stray cats, they too require a response. Enter each day, Sam Keen instructs in Hymns to an Unknown God, with the expectation that the happenings of the day may contain a clandestine message addressed to you personally. Expect omens, epiphanies, casual blessings, and teachers who unknowingly speak to your condition. Expect that through the right lens, all our encounters will appear full of thunderbolts and instruction, every bush a burning bush. In whatever form these signal events come to us, they often seem to indicate a conspiracy, a breathing together, a way in which events on the outside and the inside work together and match each other. The event and our state of mind at the time become like the two eyepieces of a binocular microscope. They are both looking at the same subject, the same truth. If there's no match, there's probably no meaning and no call. The world never stops calling, though. It constantly sends out flares the way we send signals out into space, hoping that someone will come across them, will understand what they mean, will trace the calls. While working in the civil rights movement many years ago, Bo Lazoff learned the dangers of becoming sensitized to the world. When you recognize that the world has many faces, and that sometimes it's the face of someone stricken and in pain, and other times the face of a Gorgon who can turn you to stone with a single glance, your heart can break in many places. In fact, the human heart is incapable of containing the world's suffering without breaking, yet only by breaking does it make room for the world's suffering. The trouble with trying to change the world, I once heard someone say, is that weeks can go by and nothing happens. Bo Lazoff learned that if we wait to tend to suffering until we've dealt with our own, we'll never get around to wiping away so much as a single teardrop of anyone else's. Bo and his wife Sita are the founders and directors of the Prison Ashram Project out of North Carolina, which is dedicated to teaching prisoners to use their time for inner growth, their cells as ashrams, and to think of themselves as prisoner monks rather than convicts. Having taken part in the civil rights movement and spent time in ashrams studying karma yoga, the yoga of service, Bo felt primed for a way to serve. In 1972, when he was 25, the world obliged, though it was certainly different from anything I would have dreamed of doing, he says. While visiting his brother-in-law, who was in prison in Indiana for a drug bust, they talked about a particular prison guard. That guy, his brother-in-law said, is the only human being who works in this joint. If it wasn't for him, I'd have been chopped meat a couple of times over. He's a righteous dude. I could feel the depth of admiration he had for this guy, Bo says. The guard was a decent person instead of corrupt or brutal. And that was the remark that went in deep someplace and started bothering me. On the drive back to North Carolina, he replayed their conversation over and over and kept seeing the image of the guard in his head. 20 miles from home, he passed a sign by the side of the road. New federal prison being built on this spot. He applied there to be a prison guard but was turned down. The warden, though, was interested in his ideas about yoga and meditation classes at the prison and asked him to put together a proposal. Within an hour, he was making plane reservations for Bo to fly to Washington, D.C. to meet and talk about it with the heavyweights at the Bureau of Prisons, and within a very short time, Bo and Sita were teaching in prisons all over the country, without degrees, credentials, certificates, or any formal training, and doing it because they were perfectly suited to provide something missing in the world. You've got to stay open to the touch of madness in the world, Bo says. You never expect the wild card, but it's there. One form the wild card takes is synchronicity. Synchronicities are events connected to one another, not strictly by cause and effect, but by what in classical times were known as sympathies. This is the belief that an acausal affinity exists between events inside and outside ourselves, a cross-talk between the conscious and unconscious, mind and matter, humanity and nature, all of which is governed by a certain species of gravity. Carl Jung believed that synchronicities mirror deep psychological processes, carry messages the way dreams do, and take on meaning and provide guidance to the degree that they correspond to emotional states and inner experiences, to thoughts, feelings, visions, dreams, and premonitions. A synchronicity is a coincidence that has an analog in the psyche. Depending on how we understand meaningful coincidence, it can inform us, primarily through intuition, how near or far we are from what Carlos Castaneda calls the path with heart. Among shamanic cultures, says anthropologist Michael Harner in The Way of the Shaman, synchronicities are considered one of the signs of a certain fidelity to psychophysical fitness, a kind of homing beacon analogous to a radio directional signal indicating that the right procedures and methods are being employed. Synchronicities can therefore help us follow the right paths and procedures, and following them can in turn bring on synchronicities. As chemist Louis Pasteur said, "Did you ever observe to whom the accidents happen? Chance favors the prepared mind." The portals of art. Some years ago I sat down and divided a piece of paper into 3 columns, and made lists comparing the characteristics of the 3 arts to which I have devoted most of my own creative energies: writing, piano playing, and drawing. When I was finished, I realized that the 3 lists were identical. that all these arts are leavened by the same ingredients: composition, tone, drama, color, surprise. They are all glass-bottom boats over the unconscious. They all render self-portraits and invite contemplation. They all remark on the need for balance between centeredness and eccentricity. And they all involve discerning priorities: what must be kept and what must be discarded, what must be left in and what left out, what's important to express and what's not important. They are all, as Sean McNiff writes in his book Art as Medicine, articulators of the soul's uncensored purpose and deepest will. These three arts all pit the creator against the uncreated, against the sheer compulsion to make something new under the sun, a sound never heard, an image never imagined, a solution never thought of. They all teach that there is a process to any kind of creativity. There are certain steps to go through that cannot be short-circuited, and instant art, like instant intimacy, requires no real commitment. Like dreams, these arts all present information that's on the brink of consciousness. Ultimately, creativity and discernment have much in common. They increase our ability to draw out, to call into being what didn't exist in our lives before. We do a rain dance. We say the magic words. We pull from chaos a pinch of this and a dash of that. We take a lump of clay and breathe life into its nostrils. Just as sculptors often speak of freeing forms from stone or wood rather than creating them, we too, through the artistic process, work to liberate the spirit trapped in matter, the soul implicit in what the alchemists called the massa confusa of our lives. We work, and ideally we learn, to separate our own calls from the background noise. This is exactly why I began my own journal writing at the age of 19, and I have kept at it every year since. I was at that time contemplating making the first big decision of my independent young life, to quit the college that I hated, even though I had financial aid, and transfer to one that offered classes in journalism. I not only had to discern a calling, I had to contend with much background noise, including my parents' confoundment and the loss of the financial aid. The writing and self-reflection helped me find my own voice in the wilderness, as well as clarity and courage. Keeping a journal mirrored my struggle and called me deeper into it. It was instrumental in precipitating the change I eventually made, because the simple act of recording my behavior interfered with that behavior, gave me a quasi-outside perspective on myself and the opportunity to make adjustments. Through that first journal, I discovered that although there's a social language I'm compelled to speak, and often struggle mightily to make my own, there's also a private language, a way I speak only to myself. Each time I use it, I strengthen my connection to myself. The journal thus became a safe place in which to rehearse my feelings before articulating them to others. Initially, it was unsettling putting my thoughts down on paper, unnerving to see them all there in black and white, and to read thoughts I'd often kept private even from myself. My writing in that journal seemed at the time embarrassing and dangerous, though no more dangerous, I thought, than not writing it. Ultimately, we all possess creativity, although we may not all have the courage to act on it. But even if you have tuned out your creative impulses, you still can't entirely amputate creativity from your life. At the very least, it will find its way into your dreams and fantasies. When you go out into the garden and cut some flowers and arrange them in a vase with the yellows in front and the purples behind and the blues in between, you're being an artist. When you absent-mindedly whistle while you work, you're making music. When you sit down to write a letter to a friend, you're writing. When you tap on the desk with your fingers, you're drumming. If self-discovery is your intention in art-making, if you want to draw out the calls that are embedded deep in your soul, then the more emphasis you put on formal standards of art and aesthetics, the less raw personality you will see in whatever you create. If you make discernment of your callings your priority, then the quality of your creative efforts is determined by how honest they are, how true the expressions are to your inner experiences. It is not determined by popularity, or marketability, or technique, or talent. Think of yourself as having genius in the original sense of the word, which meant having a genie, a guardian spirit, which everyone possesses. In her book, O Pioneers, Willa Cather remarks that there are only 2 or 3 human stories, and they go on repeating themselves as fiercely as if they had never happened before. She doesn't say what those 2 or 3 stories are, but nearly 20 years into my career as a journalist writing about human stories, and after a lifetime of living my own, I began wondering what stories deep down she was referring to. Love? Alienation? Death and rebirth? I'd begun feeling weary of the stories I was telling, of the struggle and pathos of our little local stories, as the psychologist Jean Houston puts it. I began feeling that I was missing something vital about story and didn't know what it was. Then, in a move that seemed scandalous to virtually everyone I knew, and even to myself, I stopped reading the daily newspaper entirely, stopped listening to the radio, and canceled all 8 of my magazine subscriptions. I entered a kind of seclusion from story, a hermitage from the news. To my great astonishment, I maintained this fast for years. I experienced the kind of relief I feel when someone's car alarm, which has been stuck in the on position for the last hour, finally stops. It was a blessed silence and spaciousness that over time helped me realize that what I was after was not just a sabbatical from the same old stories, but a nose for a different kind of news, the journalistic equivalent of a look at Earth from outer space, the chance to re-empathize with the world. I began to realize that beneath the stories of our lives are other stories, other lives, and great archetypal armatures on which all our individual stories are hung. I discovered dramas that are taking place in an arena so large that by comparison all our local stories, even all the news of the world, seem like the tempest in the teapot. I discovered myth, which is among the oldest art forms and the source of our original creation stories. Myths, like dreams, are stories in symbolic language, in images, and although we have mostly forgotten this, they are stories we've been prepared to encounter from earliest childhood, when we were read nursery rhymes and fairy tales, the preschool of myths. Myths, too, begin with once upon a time, meaning not just a time that once was, but also this time right now, and all the time yet to come. Myth, says J.F. Bierlein in Parallel Myths, is the ancestor of science. It's our first fumbling attempt to explain how things happen. It is also the forebear of philosophy and religion, in that it tries to explain why things happen. Myth is also the earliest form of literature, preceding recorded history by thousands of years. Myths are metaphors, analogies, stories that get at the heart of human behavior, at profound truths, universal themes, ageless patterns. They are, perhaps above all, stories of transformation, from chaos to form, sleep to awakening, woundedness to wholeness, folly to wisdom, from being lost to finding our way. They describe the stages of life, the initiations we all go through as we move from one level to another, child to adult, young to old, single to married, cowardly to courageous, life to death, death to life. The Odyssey, for example, isn't just Ulysses' story, and The Wizard of Oz is not just Dorothy's. They are the accounts of anyone struggling to find the way home. Hansel and Gretel is not just the misadventure of a couple of children, but, among other things, a parable about being lost and devoured. To the degree we are each looking for the places where callings break into our lives as emissaries of the sacred, it would serve us well to take pen and paper and try reframing our lives as myths. Begin by describing in a word or phrase the theme of your present search, that is, your heroic journey. Remember, myths are about characters in the process of transformation. As you write your myth, have a particular challenge in mind. Begin with Once Upon a Time. Making pilgrimage. In searching out the mystery of our own callings, in trying to find answers to our most basic questions of meaning and purpose, we can leave our houses, take to the road on a pilgrimage, and simply ask those questions that seem obvious but often aren't. Who am I? What matters? What is my gift? What do I need to hear? What on earth am I doing? Questioning is at the heart of spiritual journeying, of removing ourselves from the duties and dramas, the relationships and roles that bombard us with messages that may be distracting or irrelevant or even destructive to our emerging sense of self, and then interfere with our asking for responses to our burning questions. In making pilgrimage, we're calling on God rather than the other way around. We're crying for a vision, as the Oglala Sioux holy man Black Elk called it, the one that may reveal our true vocation, our real name, our purpose. The one that may come as a dream, a fantasy figure, a voice in the head, an animal encounter, an overpowering emotion, a sudden inspiration or surge of creative energy, a chance meeting out at a crossroads. We're practicing the art of following calls because spiritual journeys, like calls, involve a break with everyday life. I went to strip away what I had been taught, Georgia O'Keeffe once said, describing her retreat to New Mexico from New York City in the 1920s, "To accept as true my own thinking. This was one of the best times of my life. There was no one around to look at what I was doing, no one interested, no one to say anything about it one way or another. I was alone and singularly free." Pilgrims, says theologian Richard Niebuhr, are persons in motion, passing through territories not their own, seeking completion or clarity, a goal to which only the Spirit's compass points the way. Sometimes that motion is religious and sometimes secular. Sometimes we design our own journeys and sometimes we follow in the paths of those we revere. Sometimes we journey with the body and sometimes with the mind. Our approach depends on our primary way of experiencing the Spirit. Sometimes we make the journey in private, in solitary retreat or solo vision quest in the wilderness, and other times in crowds, like the great pilgrimages to Mecca, Benares, Rome, Jerusalem, and Compostela in Spain, which resemble enormous migrations. Simply taking up a bedroll and hitting the road won't generally suffice to alert the forces of enlightenment, however. They require that you do more than just move around. Whether we go to the Ganges or Graceland, maintaining a spirit of observance and self-reflection is key. We must be intent on spending time searching for soul, moving towards something that represents to us an ideal, truth, beauty, love, perspective, strength, serenity, transcendence, or sacredness. Spiritual journeying, whether we walk around a holy mountain or sit in a single place on a 5-day meditation retreat, is about interior or exterior movement toward the deep self. A geographical journey is symbolic of an inner journey for which we long. Whether or not spiritual journeys involve an excursion into nature, they are formidable because all rites of passage necessitate that we leave our old selves behind, leave the trappings of identity and status, and move to a place where no one knows or cares who we are. Like pilgrims on the Hajj to Mecca, who are all required to wear the same tunic, in taking to the road, we wear the cloak of anonymity, the prospect of which may fill us with a certain dread, or, if we're lucky, relief. For these and other reasons, many spiritual teachers recommend guides for extended meditation retreats, vision quests, and pilgrimages deep into nature. It is useful and occasionally critical to have the guidance of someone who has gone this way before you, who knows the ropes, is familiar with the psychological and physical terrain, can help prepare you for what you might encounter, and who provides the motivating element of leadership. Beyond that, feel free to design your journey to suit yourself, drawing on any practice that keeps you focused on your goal. Make music, sing songs, paint pictures, write in a journal, practice yoga, walk all day in the wilderness, or just sit still. Pray, read holy books, or stare fixedly out the window. Abstain from talking or sleeping or socializing, or fast to remind yourself that you're hungry. In the story of the quest for the Holy Grail, the hero Parsifal must ask the right question. In this case, whom does the Grail serve? Only by surrendering to his curiosity is he able to help heal the king and the kingdom. He doesn't actually need to secure the answer himself. He only needs to ask the question. Spiritual journeys, like stories, have at their core a central question, as do our lives. And if we understand not even the answers but merely the questions that animate our own journeys, we've understood a lot. What question is at the heart of your pilgrimage and your life? What question were you put here to understand? Fran Peavy has a daily meditation practice during which she asks herself a single question. What can I do to help the earth? Her life is both the testing ground for that question and the response to it. She calls the answers she receives promptings, and she has followed them into the most unorthodox arenas and unexpected pilgrimages. The most consistent answer she's received to this question over the years has been simply, listen. This eventually led her to decide that in order to serve people more properly as a social activist working to prevent nuclear war, she had to know a little more about people. So she sold her house, paid off her debts, and with some of the remaining money bought a plane ticket around the world. She asked friends to send her the names of people she could talk to and stay with, and she planned to go only to those cities where she had 4 or more contacts. Since she also wanted to talk to people at random, she came up with the idea of sitting on park benches all over the world, holding a cloth sign that said, "American willing to listen." And for 4 months, she did just that. She sat on park benches and listened to people talk about their lives. It was, she describes, one of the scariest ideas I've ever had. The journey began in Japan, and it took Fran several days before she got up the nerve to carry out her plan. Finally, one day, she unfolded a 2-by-3-foot cloth sign, laid on the ground in front of her bench, and waited. Time passed, she said. People came over, sized me up, and walked away. I tried to smile pleasantly, all the while thinking, this is a bad idea. I've spent a lot of money, and the plan isn't working. I'm making a fool of myself. This is a mistake. Half an hour passed before someone finally sat down next to her, a man in his 30s, and told her about some of his concerns. The border war between North and South Korea over control of rubber trees, the investment of massive amounts of Japanese capital in China, the extent of consumption and consumerism in Japan and other developed countries, even his views on the relations between the sexes. His wife was part of a women's consciousness-raising group, and he and the other husbands felt envious of it. They had tried to start their own, but it fell apart and he was disappointed. As Fran's confidence grew and her fears ebbed, people began lining up to talk with her, and it showed me how little I knew about the world, she says. It occurred to me that I might have to go on interviewing full-time for the rest of my life to get any sense of what was going on in the world. This is practically what she's done. Her listening project, which she writes about in her book Heart Politics, has become a continuing practice, a kind of tuning up of my heart to the affairs of the world, she says. I hear the news differently now and act with a larger context in mind. I hold myself accountable to the people whose lives I have seen and carry with me some of their pain. It does not weigh me down. Nor does her daily practice of setting aside 1 hour from 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock in the afternoon, during which people come to talk with her. I don't charge them, but I ask that they each bring a rock. The green rocks go into the bathroom upstairs, and the rest go out into the rock garden. Perhaps looking for the right rock helps them focus on what it is they're looking for, why they're coming to see me. They ask questions, most frequently, I want to help the world, how can I plug in? They often think they need to have big ideas, but I encourage them to start small, otherwise they can get a spiritual hernia. Instead of demanding clear-cut answers, it is better to hope for visitations, images that might linger like alpenglow in the mind's eye, a flood of lyrics or music, a voluminous and eloquent silence, a surge of electrons in the brain that illuminates a vision or a dream. The deep questions may not have singular answers, but multitudes of them. Questions, of course, can be exhausting and also occasionally dangerous. In some countries, they're fatal. But the biddings of personal evolution and conscience, especially as they impress themselves on us during a rigorous spiritual journey, often require that we question everything we, and often others, hold dear. Our standards for ourselves, the purpose of life as recorded in the gospel of parental and social instruction, and the most fundamental priorities by which we've led our lives. This can have the most valiant vision quester whimpering for a nightlight, and explains why Black Elk often referred to the vision quest as the lamentation. As a frequent lecturer and teacher, I am sometimes appalled at the consistency with which people say, I know this is a stupid question, but... What I hear in this ubiquitous statement is a common anxiety that attends the quest for knowledge, the fear of being shamed for the lack of it, or the want of it. Unfortunately, this fear is often warranted. Questions are not always welcomed, and many of us have been shamed for our inquisitiveness, either outright or insidiously. We have all had the experience of asking a question and having others quickly change the subject, or ahem at us in polite company, or tell us we think too much, or turn stiffly back to their chores as if they never heard us ask, or send us from the table or down to the principal's office. Most of us can probably remember the effect of asking a certain question of a certain person who didn't want to be asked. The time you asked the nuns how Christ could possibly have been resurrected when he'd been dead for 3 days and there was a large stone covering his grave. The time you asked your doctor to explain every test result in detail. The time you asked your mother, while she was entertaining the ladies of the auxiliary, how babies are born. The time you asked why Daddy drinks so much. There are also the questions we don't even want to ask ourselves, for fear that we may not be able to come up with an answer, or that we may, and then we won't be able to erase it from our minds. Lake Superior is an inland sea. It is the largest lake on the planet, more than 1,200 miles around, and one of the most volatile, capable of whipping itself into a frenzy of 30-foot seas, and famous for its shipwrecks. It is also one of the coldest. For most of the year, the water temperature is in the mid-30s, about as cold as water can be without turning into something else. During the hand test, Anne Linnea found that she could hold her hand in the water for only 9 seconds. Kayaking around the lake would be the most dangerous thing she had ever done. The idea had first come up 5 years earlier, when Anne and a longtime friend, Paul Truer, bought a couple of used kayaks, and after their first exhilarating runs on the lake, he said, "I bet we could kayak around this whole lake." To which she replied, "Yeah, right." Nothing would have come of it, except that that little seed happened to drop into fertile soil. The part of me, said Anne, a former National Forest Service naturalist and marathoner, that always wanted to do one long wilderness adventure. As the years went by, it would also be nourished by another part of her. She describes it this way. "I knew vaguely that I was approaching the end of some kind of life cycle. The life my parents lived, the life I thought I was raised to live. Wife, mother, home, good citizen. I wondered, is this the fullness of what I can be doing? I wanted to reset the course of my life, to come to clarity about what the gift is I'm supposed to return to the world, and I thought the trip could teach me. The question that I brought with me and kept asking over and over was, am I doing the most I possibly can with my life? My purpose was to find a purpose, to find the deepest courage in myself, to look for the extraordinary growth, not just the ordinary day-to-day growth, which is certainly valid, but it was the kind of incremental journeying my whole life had been about. I wanted to step outside of that, to really open the door wide, which is why I liked the symbolism of Lake Superior. It was so wide I couldn't see across it, couldn't see what was on the other side, and that was just the magnitude of change I was inviting. To grow beyond the expectations we're raised with is a radical act, but one I felt was necessary to claiming my full self. The trip Anne and Paul eventually took in the summer of 1992 was, as Anne described it, a self-designed midlife rite of passage, which I chose to make rather than it choosing me, and I chose an arena in which I was the most skilled, comfortable, and inspired. She chose kayaking because I learn best by using my body, by moving until I have insight. She chose a wilderness trip because all my life I have sought wild places for good counsel. And she chose Lake Superior because it was really important to me that the journey take place in my own backyard rather than someplace exotic. Her parents were slightly aghast that she could leave her children, a 3rd grader and a 6th grader, for the whole summer. Her husband couldn't understand why she had to be gone so long, over 2 months. One friend wanted to know if they had really considered the dangers, and another pointed out that if no woman had ever circumnavigated the lake, there must be a good reason. Although modest, the currents moved counterclockwise around Lake Superior, and Anne and Paul were headed clockwise, against the currents, because they wanted to hit the wildest stretch of the lake, the north side, early in the trip, and because, as Anne said, it just felt right, and because it was symbolic. They were also, unbeknownst to them, following a very ancient pilgrimage tradition, that of circumambulating a holy site in a clockwise direction. At a deep level, we all associate journeying with circularity. We buy round-trip tickets, whether our actual trajectory is circular or not. Whether it be around a person, a shrine, a temple, a lake, a mountain, a country, or even as some have done around the world, a simple mathematical principle defines the purpose of circumambulation. By drawing the circle, we define the center. By circling the lake, Anne was turning around the axis of her one desire, to locate her own center and to know it from all sides. At one point during Anne's voyage, she glimpsed the center. One evening about a third of the way into the trip, She stumbled onto the ruins of an old stone altar, a miniature Stonehenge, whose rocks were stacked 10 feet high on a narrow terrace above the shore. In the presence of the indigenous, she saw a vision of her own life that she described as fleeting, like a deer startled at the edge of a clearing who quickly disappears into the safety of brush. But I know I saw it. It was an image of herself as finally able to embrace spirituality in everything I did. Actually, she was ready to re-embrace spirituality. Earlier in her life, she had had an unabashed relationship with what she calls spirit. In junior high school, she once wrote a vocational paper about being a missionary, and her parents told her, "Don't get so carried away with the religious stuff," a comment she unfortunately took deeply to heart. She got the message that in order for her passion for spirit to be accepted, she would have to temper it. It wasn't until I went around the lake that I returned to that pure passion for a spirit-filled life and felt encouraged to follow it. That would mean, among other things, taking a step away from the schools and environmental education centers where she had taught for many years. I always had to be very careful about how I presented ideas about spirituality. But I was really ready to bring spiritual presence, meditation and prayer, open discussion of spirit and mystery, into my work in a way that was uninhibited. That was probably the biggest truth I discovered on the trip. I wanted to have the courage to make spirit be at the foremost of everything I did. Anne Linnaeus' grueling rite of passage in the wilderness, a journey of more than 1,200 miles and 65 days, long stretches of which were spent entirely alone after she and Paul decided to take different routes, and the daily practices of keeping a journal, prayer, ritual, and asking for dreams, enabled her to find the coordinates of her own center, to find her way back to her deepest courage, the courage to live beyond a focus on safety and security, to reset the course of her life. Her return also involved a difficult period of transition, during which she had to try to translate the level of physical courage she learned on the trip into the emotional courage she needed to make the changes. The toast she made with Paul on the last day of the trip, with a bottle of Kahlua passed between them, was most appropriate. To a damn good trip and a damn fine friend, and for the courage to deal with all that lies ahead. Part of which was the realization that, as she put it, the most vulnerable time for new truth in our lives is immediately after its discovery. The next day, in flat, calm seas, they returned to 26 people waiting on the beach in welcome, and quickly realized that they had made no provisions for the transition back. Part of re-entering involved dealing with a few basic physical matters and brushing up on some lapsed social skills. Her sense of hearing had become so keen that all phone ringers had to be set to mute for weeks. Her sense of smell was so acute that she couldn't walk down the street without being besieged by the smell of the neighbor's garbage cans. She had virtually no ability to engage in small talk. The inevitable question, "Did you have a nice trip?" left me dumbfounded, unable to speak. I was really out of sync with people. She had also hoped, on returning, that the trip would help reform her marriage of 22 years, which she described as unemotional, businesslike, and efficient. Her intention on returning, she says, was to work hard to strengthen my family and marriage, to try and include more emotion, more spirit and passion. But clearly there wasn't room for that. What I needed was not what he needed or wanted. 9 months after the end of the trip, Anne removed her wedding ring, which didn't come off easily, and said to her husband, "It feels to me that we're moving into a different kind of relationship here, and it's not about a traditional marriage." After another 9 months of working hard to make the transition from marriage partners to friends who wanted to continue raising their children together, and of unraveling some of their entwined roots, Anne and the children moved to Whidbey Island in Washington State. Anne co-founded with a friend a seminar and teaching business called Peer Spirit, whose motto, fittingly, is "In Service to the Circle," and whose 3 guiding principles are that leadership rotates, responsibility is shared, and ultimate reliance is on spirit. Anne's experience in making the transition back home is instructive of a critical phase of the spiritual journey, the return. Re-entry is a sort of decompression, and like returning from a deep-sea dive, it's best handled slowly. If you move too fast, you endanger yourself and your experience. In fact, it's one of the simplest ways to sabotage a spiritual journey. On the last day of a vision quest that I took into the Trinity Alps in Northern California some years ago, one of the guides, Jay Wood, warned me that whatever promises I made to myself during the journey, whatever insights I gained and intentions I set, I would need to defend them against the tendency of life to level all uprisings. to stomp my enthusiasms back into low relief. "Be careful," he said, "lest I twist an ankle going back down the mountain, get into a car wreck on the drive home, get sick, or get into arguments with others. Beware of impulses, however unconscious, that might trigger a panic of retreat back to the relative safety of the comfort zone." He reminded me that after big openings often come big closings, after highs, lows, after breakthroughs, breakdowns. Being part of a couple, I knew this one by heart. Intense fights often follow intense intimacy. Jay's admonition, post a guardian at the gate. Memory's vital secrets. The writer Toni Morrison once described how the Mississippi River had been straightened out in places to make room for houses and livable acreage, and how occasionally the river will flood these places. Flood is the word they use, she said, but in fact it is not flooding, it is remembering where it used to be. All water has a perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was. People, too, have perfect memory for some things, and one of the purposes of reviewing our own histories, Morrison says, is to remind ourselves of where we were before we were straightened out and paved over. Personal recollection can help us remember what we already know, and the healing properties of memory and imagination, which of course are blood relations, can help us recapture our natural curves. History is a story, and the telling of deep stories is the doing of soul work. Our past is intricately woven into our calls, and we can learn much about these calls by casting the occasional glance backward. The past tells us what has passed on to us and what we're attuned to because of it. It tells us what wounds might be calls in waiting, what business is unfinished. It tells us what footprints we follow, what legacies and dynasties we're driven to carry on, what damnations we're driven to transmute, even what wrongs we feel compelled to right. In recollecting the past, you needn't compile an exhaustive account of your life, although some explorers such as Carl Jung, Carlos Castaneda, Nikos Kazantzakis, and Buddha have gone over the details of their entire lives in the service of self-knowledge, in Jung's case, twice. You can narrow your sights and still see a lot. You can focus just on developmental areas like childhood, adolescence, middle or old age. You can remember what took place in the arenas of schooling, spirituality, relationships, creativity. You can even write your autobiography. You can also enter into dialogue with the forces that formed you. You can talk with your father or mother, with the house you grew up in, with the biggest decision of your life, with your most powerful conviction, or with the ghost of whatever saint has hovered near you all your life. In The Mystery of My Story, Paula Farrell Sullivan recounts the experience of a man who wrote a lengthy dialogue with his old algebra book, realizing in the process that what had deterred him from entering medical school was his fear of math. He also discovered that this option was still open to him, this call still called to him, so in his 40s he quit his job and went to medical school. However we recount our personal histories, whether we conjure them through writing, drawing, audio taping, or videotaping, we go to them not for a bland reportage, but for a literature of the person, not for the view through a knothole, which is often the perspective we get on our present lives from inside them, from present time, but for the panorama. We go to them with the understanding that, as Einstein said, no discovery was ever made except by those who were willing to lift their noses off the grindstone of details and take in the big picture. The one that shows us our lives have patterns every bit as distinct as those that land takes on when seen from the air. They have substance, forward momentum, designs of their own. I once saw an eagle drop like a stone into the blue-green water of a bay in the Sea of Cortez. For the better part of a minute, he thrashed around violently on the surface, rising a little, and then it seemed being yanked back down, sometimes nearly underwater. Finally he rose, clapping his wings loudly against the water, and lifted out a fish almost as large as himself, carrying it off to a cliffside nest. Whatever lives beneath the surface will usually put up a fight to stay there, and this goes for some of the wildlife we're likely to encounter in diving into our own pasts. We're up against that which doesn't want to be remembered and wants to remain anonymous, invisible, mute, to cover itself with dirt and leaves and hide while the posse gallops by. We're up against whatever we've rejected throughout the run of our lives, the parts of us that split off and went tumbling away, our unlived life, the animal that sleeps at our doorstep. These unlived parts can include negative qualities such as anger, fear, weakness, aggression, vanity, idealism, lust, laziness, tears, everything we were instructed not to talk about because it was too embarrassing and too private, all the ghettos and back alleys of our psyches. The unlived parts of ourselves can also include positive qualities like power, leadership, trust, compassion, commitment, sensitivity, sexuality, creativity, faith, exuberance, and the contents of that 90% of our brains we haven't figured out how to use. These rejected parts include whatever wasn't loved, respected, and accepted in us by ourselves or our parents, teachers, peers, religion, and culture. Carl Jung called it our shadow. Robert Bly calls it the long bag we drag behind us. In it are all those qualities that were disapproved of by the people whose approval we needed in order to survive, or believed we needed. Here's how Bly explains it. When we were 1 or 2 years old, we had a 360-degree personality. Energy radiated from all parts of us. But as soon as our parents began saying things like, "Can't you be still?" or "Sit up straight," or "Quit running around," or "Don't be smarter than the boys," or "Don't touch yourself there," or "Don't talk to strangers," or "Boys can't be dancers," we started stuffing parts of ourselves in the bag in order to assure an uninterrupted flow of our parents' love and approval, even if it was only measured out by the eyedropper. We then responded the same way to our teachers, our cronies, our colleagues, and our culture, and by the time we were 20 or so, our pie was reduced to a sliver, and a terrible wealth of talent and soul was imprisoned. In becoming civilized, we became brutish, tyrannical with our energies, and fascist in our repressions. We had no choice, however. It was our soul's way of protecting us, the only way we could make our way through. In whatever we rejected, though, is something that a part of us wants, and there lies a calling that we should follow, if only for the sake of completing the jigsaw and healing the past. We want that anger and that creativity, and the creative power that anger can be if we learn how to use it. We want those tears that swab the soul. We want access to the top of our lungs where the shouts and the holy hosannas are, the whoops and wails and hullabaloos, not just the bottom of our lungs, which is reserved for whispers and polite conversation, for things said under the breath. Ignoring these needs isn't the ticket. If we don't go to them, if we don't occasionally arrange the lighting so that our shadows are cast forward where we can see them, in all likelihood they'll come at us from behind. They'll lodge themselves between our intentions and our achievements, thumbing their noses at our attempts to get them off the playing field. They'll become the downstairs neighbors who bang on the ceiling with a broomstick while we're busy having a party. It does not do you good, J.R.R. Tolkien once said, to leave a dragon out of your calculations if you live near him. Jung considered it a foregone conclusion that whatever we're unwilling to face in ourselves we'll be forced to confront in the outer world, that our past doesn't obediently stay in the past, and that our lives will conspire in 100 ways to call us toward those very things. What we most want to run from will end up running toward and drawing to us, the way sharks are attracted to thrashing bodies. The material I was determined to elude has claimed me, the writer Pat Hampel once described. When she started college at the University of Minneapolis, she lost no time in dumping the Catholic world her parents had so carefully constructed for her. This is why she chose to go. I understood that many people had succeeded in losing their religion at the university. For decades, she considered it a shining achievement that she had eluded the nuns. Result? She spent the better part of 5 years writing a memoir about growing up Catholic, the protagonist a contemplative nun. There is no walking away from our shadows or the radioactive elements of our past, any more than we can walk away from an angry partner and expect him or her to not still be angry when we come back, any more than we can shove unpaid bills in a drawer and expect the electricity to stay on, any more than we can pour poison into the ground and not expect it to come up through the fruits and vegetables. There's no away, there's no out, as in throwing the garbage out, no trash icon, no abort function. Like the earth, our psyches are closed systems. If you're at all worried about being overwhelmed by your past or your shadow, reckon with it in a caretaking situation such as therapy or a therapeutic workshop. You can't just pull the contents out of the bag like you're pulling feathers out of a pillow, at least not without psychological readiness and considerable emotional effort, as well as some grounding, a solid relationship or two, a work life, a community or support group, some stabilizing routines, and a life with which you're not already overwhelmed. Above all, says Thomas More, take it easy. The shadow is a frightening reality, and anyone who talks blithely about integrating it as if you could chum up to the shadow the way you learn a foreign language doesn't know the darkness that always qualifies shadow. Flight to Tarshish. I was standing in the kitchen when I saw the dust devil hurl itself around the corner of the house. Spraying the windows with sand and grit as it flew, headed for the open garage. There hadn't been a single breeze all day. It came out of nowhere. The next thing I heard a few seconds later was a loud expletive, and then silence again, the whirlwind evaporating into the blue sky as instantaneously as it came. I opened the inside door to the garage but couldn't see through the cloud of brown dust to the other side. And from somewhere in the middle of that cloud I heard a disembodied voice swearing. My partner Robin had sequestered herself in the garage studio to paint, after coming home infuriated about an incident that happened between her and a few faculty members at the graduate school she was then attending. I had rarely seen her that outraged, and only later did she remember that, as she put it, a subtle voice in the back of her mind was telling her that she was obsessing, hanging onto her umbrage well past the point of diminished returns. A voice that was calling her to let go of her anger. It took a devil snapping the end of his towel at her to shake the rage from her, but it worked. The dust devil was like a violent replica of her angry mood, and it shook her up, drained the adrenaline from her, and freed her from being caught in her own drama. Having seen the deliberation with which the elements seemed to single out her studio from all the possible landing sites in that enormous desert, Robin believed it possible that she'd brought that little storm down on herself, and I'm inclined to agree. It was as if, by her refusal to listen to that voice in her head, she somehow reached through a barrier that normally separates the real and imaginal worlds and called down the Furies. Robin had profaned a call with a snub, however subtle and for whatever good reasons, and brought a storm down on her own head. In doing so, she was acting out a personal version of the archetypal drama we all provoke when we say no to our calls. It's the same story made famous by Jonah, patron saint of refused callings, and someone who understood better than most why natural disasters are referred to as acts of God. Jonah was called to preach to the people of Nineveh, and refused because he presumed himself to be both an incompetent preacher and yet an expert judge. He insisted the Ninevites weren't worth saving. So he went down to the docks and booked himself passage on a ship sailing in the opposite direction from Nineveh, to Tarshish. God, however, was not amused, nor fooled. He sent a storm down on the ship, not so much as punishment, but as an earnest appeal for a more affirmative response from Jonah. But Jonah, despite being the strongest sailor of them all, the one who could subdue the storm if he chose, by taking responsibility for his part in creating it, chose instead to avoid dealing with it by going to sleep in the bottom of the boat, going into a state of what's referred to nowadays as denial, which only made the storm angrier. He regained consciousness only when roused by the captain, that spirit of wakefulness, who confronted him with his responsibility for the mounting calamity. Jonah then proved himself to be a man of considerable courage. He confessed that he was to blame and offered himself as a sacrifice, telling the frightened crewmen that throwing him overboard was the only way to make the storm subside. Being decent and disbelieving sorts, however, they ignored his advice and rowed harder for shore, thus becoming unwitting accomplices to the crime, getaway drivers. When the storm took a violent swipe at the mainmast, they changed their minds, tossing Jonah overboard and into the belly of the whale, who delivered him 3 days later to the shores of Nineveh and unceremoniously spewed him onto the beach, a changed man. The guilt of Jonah, says Arthur Koestler in The Act of Creation, was that he clung to the trivial and tried to cultivate only his own little garden. If it's any consolation, so does almost everybody when confronted by a calling, at least initially. Everybody, to some extent, backs away from their authenticity, settles for less, hobbles their own power, doesn't speak when spoken to in dreams. Everybody occasionally ignores the promptings of the soul and then the discontent that ensues, trying to distract themselves by counting their blessings, all the reasons they ought to be happy with their lot in life, content with things as they are, things that may once have been be-alls and end-alls, but that lost their intoxication after 5 years, put them on automatic pilot after 10, and became a prison after 15. We all have a part of us, forever incalculable and arch, that simply fears change and reacts to it with a reflexive flinch, the way snails recoil at the touch and birds bolt for the sky. And a calling is a messenger of change, a bell that tolls for thee, and it brings on the fear that frightens away sleep. There's no guarantee that change will be a change for the better. Resistance is not only universal, but instinctive. It may be contrary to the open-mindedness and resilience we would prefer, and that seems so necessary to getting through life with any measure of grace, but it's still involuntary. Our brains are wired for it. For one thing, in the course of an average lifetime, trillions of bits of information pour into our brains through the senses, and if we didn't tune some of them out, our circuits would fry. If we didn't respond to change with some resistance, every incoming stimulus would set off an outbreak of reflexes that would put Pavlov's dogs to shame. If we had no impulse toward caution, our curiosities would probably kill us. We'd probably step out of the car at the safari park. Resistance is also critical to the health of the immune system and to mental health, when it assumes the form of defense mechanisms, which can protect us against the possibility of being overwhelmed by the boogeyman of sudden change. It's hard to give up a symptom that's so useful. Ultimately, there are just as many reasons not to follow a calling as there are to follow it, and both good and bad consequences either way. You just need to figure out what decisions will assure that when your life flashes before your eyes, it holds your interest. Resistance blooms naturally in the presence of change. You will encounter resistance in all attempts at ascendance, physical or spiritual. If our resistance to a calling doesn't take the form of outright refusal, whether it's a quiet withdrawal from life or an obstinate stomp on the ground with a puff of dirt for an exclamation point, then it often puts us into a state of suspended animation, a kind of emotional agnosticism in which we neither confirm nor deny the call, but live in a netherworld of maybes. By doing this, says Eric Maisel in his book Fearless Creating, we avoid the anxiety of saying yes and the guilt of saying no, though it isn't a state of calmness and equilibrium, but of tension and maddening equivocation. Prolonged, it is soul-withering and bone-dissolving. It is vital, he says, that you clearly hear this deadly silent no, this damned 7/8 no that can steal decades from your life. In order to say yes, Maisel insists, you must first say no more forthrightly, must know precisely where you stand. Better to be frankly disappointed in yourself that the no is so loud than to be bitterly disappointed in yourself after decades of secret no-saying. Let yourself have the no. Learn to hear it. Learn to say it. Hate it, but hear it. Remember, though, that resistance is also a good omen. It means you're close to something important, something vital for your soul's work here, something worthy of you. If it feels safe, it's probably not the right path, Mark Gerzon says in Coming Into Our Own. But if it scares you, it probably is. The degree of resistance, too, is probably proportionate to the amount of power waiting to be unleashed, and the satisfaction to be experienced once the no breaks through to a yes and the call is followed. Once you allow your passion and faith to wash you overboard and carry you to the shores of Nineveh to be expelled in a pool of ambergris. We decline the invitation of our callings because we feel inadequate to the task, but the opposite is also true. We're afraid of our own power. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate, says author Marianne Williamson. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. But our playing small doesn't serve the world. There's nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. Ron Jones can vouch for that. He relates a story about his father, who was a musician at heart, but who worked for 35 years selling televisions, refrigerators, and glassware in a department store in San Francisco. One day he was told that the store was closing. In those days there were no golden parachutes or retirement benefits, and when they asked him if there was anything they could do for him, his only request was to have the chair he'd been sitting in all those years. They sold it to him. He brought that chair to my house on his back one day, says Ron, a writer and storyteller, and placed it in my living room and told me about all the years he had sat in it, and then made me promise that I would never sit down in that chair ever. It's in my living room to this day, and I never sit in it. I just tell the story, and the lesson my father passed on to me through it. Don't sit down in life. All through your life, Ron says, you're going to be asked to sit down, to conform, comply, and compromise, and it can be very deadly if you get in the habit of doing that. Be leery of the price of conformity, my father told me. Stand up, create things, do things. What happens when a martyr stops making sacrifices? When a pleaser stops pleasing? When a true blue friend changes color? When a whisperer suddenly shouts, or a screamer suddenly whispers? What happens when you change whatever it was in you that others had come to rely on? In the heaving tectonics between you and others, what were once ocean bottoms or flatlands by a sleeping river now rear up into mountain divides, sometimes flung at a 90-degree angle from their original positions. What were once floors are now walls. What was once concord is now discord. What was once acceptance is now rejection. A calling can have a tragic dimension. In addition, we ourselves may not take so kindly to our own power. Although fearing power is kind of like fearing wealth, it's a little hard to get sympathy. Power does have its dangers. For one thing, taking on our power can shatter our perceptions of our own limitations, and without those perceived limitations, not enough time, or money, or talent, a bad back, too many other responsibilities, someone standing in our way, there are no longer any reasons to hold ourselves back. Say you believe, for instance, that you can't follow a calling to teach classes in your area of expertise because no one will be interested. Yet you follow the prompting anyway, and the first class fills up. Now you're going to have to wonder what other limiting beliefs you might need to update. Perhaps these include a belief that you're not good enough to teach, or there's no money in it, or it's only a matter of time before you're exposed as a fraud. As your excuses begin falling away, you begin taking the risks you'd always thought of as terrifying. Your life isn't so predictable anymore, and you start to find out who you really are, which is always a bit of an acquired taste, always a bit nerve-wracking. A key is made for only one purpose, to fit a lock. Not just any lock, one lock. Anyone who feels made to do one particular thing in this world, but who is unable to do it, becomes in a sense an unreconciled key. Eric was such a person. I first met him when he agreed to let me interview him for a magazine piece I was writing on sex change operations. I was unprepared, however, for the beautiful blonde who answered the door wearing a low-cut black dress, spiked high heels, and pink fingernails. In a husky voice, the blonde introduced herself as Erica. I was even less prepared for the turn our interview took an hour later when, as I tried to tactfully broach the subject of what Eric's body looked like halfway through the mandatory pre-operative year of hormone treatments, he said with considerable sobriety, "Would you like to see?" Stripped, Eric was a chimera, a sexual sphinx, the top half woman, the bottom half man, an object of wonder even to himself and one of astonishment to me. All his life, Eric said, he had felt alienated from himself, felt that the gods had somehow mixed up their kits, because whenever he looked in a mirror, he expected to see a woman, but kept seeing a man. All his life he felt like a spy, moving unnoticed through all the intimate realms of boyhood and manhood, locker rooms, bathrooms, dorms, clubs, fraternities, trading men's secrets, speaking their language, sharing their idiosyncratic society, and yet living in a no man's land, in a body that was all wrong for his spirit. It is not, in my estimation, an undue stretch to say that if we are living lives that are all wrong for our spirits, and if we say no to the calls that could put that spirit to rights, then we too, like Eric, are lost souls. If the earth calls to the apple and it doesn't come, it tends to rot on the tree. If a panther is confined to a cage, as the poet Rainer Maria Rilke once observed, a great will stands stunned and numb. If the timorous heart is too fearful of failure and loss, too panic-stricken to relinquish the status quo, we won't be propelled through the door. We'll remain outsiders to our own selves, and the air around us will fill with the smell of something burning on the stove. In the Afghani tongue, the verb to cling is the same as to die. A calling is not something we can turn down as we can turn down the page corners of a book, so that at our leisure we can pick up where we left off, if we pick up. No ritual can hold off the gods who deliver calls. No sleight of hand can distract them from their appointed rounds. No amount of double talk will confuse them. We cannot refuse with impunity. Neglected gods devolve into demons whose pitchforks are made from moving bodies around, and who are inclined to get our attention by shaking us until our teeth rattle in our skulls. If you bring forth what is within you, Jesus said in the Gospel of Thomas, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. Eventually, our feelings of inauthenticity and restlessness, our envy of others' successes, our panic at the passage of time, and our own reflections in the mirror all become like tombstones. They remind us of where someone is buried, and we will measure our fear of death by the distance between our desires and our actions, between the life we want and the life we have. When we say no to our callings, then the force of completion, the soul's resolve, which is faithful to us even when we're unfaithful to it, fires up its furnaces and begins working toward our conversion. The inducement of choice is typically suffering. The voice of eternity within us demands to be heard, the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard said, and to make a hearing for itself, it makes use of the loud voice of affliction, and when by the aid of affliction all irrelevant voices are brought to silence, it can be heard. If we don't attend to the soul, Thomas More adds in Care of the Soul, it will come to us in the form of symptoms. Not coincidentally, several years ago, the American Medical Association found that most heart attacks occur around 9 o'clock on Monday mornings. This undoubtedly has something to do with what most people are doing around 9 o'clock on Monday mornings, which is going back to work. Or more precisely, going back to work they don't like, to lives that are ill-matched to their spirits. It's not poisonous to do without something we really want, the writer Doris Lessing claims. What is poisonous is to pretend that the second rate is first rate, to pretend that you like your work when you know you're capable of better, to pretend you love what you don't, or don't love what you do. The great majority of people appear to have cultivated with seeming nonchalance the ability, worse the willingness, to live with uproarious noise. Housing developments are built right alongside major freeways. People picnic under the flight patterns of airports and in the shoulder lanes of highways. The jangling alarm clock is most people's method of choice for waking up in the morning. But the ability to tune out the tumult, though undoubtedly useful if you have to live in it, exacts a toll. The kind of obliviousness it requires dulls our senses, and it's no wonder it takes a loud and strident noise to get people's attention and rouse them from dormancy. Such is the logic of wake-up calls. Wake-up calls are simply calls that have become desperate to get our attention. They generally start as polite requests, gentle taps on the shoulder, whispers in the ear, and they escalate to rude shoves and barbaric yawps only after we have repeatedly ignored them. Our souls will speak as softly as possible, I have heard it said, but as loudly as they have to. Sometimes calls are muses who dab perfume gently on their wrists and their necks and anywhere else they hope to be kissed. And sometimes they're harpies spraying their smell around enough to scare the werewolves. At that point, they become crises that often alter our lives so dramatically that we have no choice but to change and do our mightiest just to cope. The sociologist Gordon Allport calls this the power of the fait accompli, the done deal. The career disaster that has the effect of blowing a hole in your hull below waterline. The accident or illness that changes everything. The partner who leaves you for someone else. The case of burnout that lands you in the hospital. The addiction that lands you in the courtroom or the newspaper. Some kinds of change can only be set in motion by a strong-arm tactic. Otherwise, the forces of habit and fear and laziness are just too stubborn. I suspect that those who experience wake-up calls usually discover, in hindsight of course, that they had received plenty of warning before the poop hit the propeller, but they had chosen to disregard it. A lot of divorces and diseases and dismissals from jobs probably don't come as a complete surprise to those who suffer them. Fights and infidelities or a morose silence fall over a relationship well before the word divorce ever splits the air. Children show us in countless ways that they need our attention well before they get mixed up with the law. We begin taking little chances at a job when we just don't care anymore. Extra long lunches, leaving work early, filtering from the stockroom, sick days from which we come back with a tan. These are indications that we're probably not long for the job. Granted, some wake-up calls are not a function of neglecting calls. Natural disasters, job layoffs, the the suicide of a friend, a sudden empty nest, the death of a child. But whatever the case, we're drop-kicked into consciousness, even if only temporarily, and we either use the experience or we don't. Either we understand that the point of the experience is to reorient us and recognize the call and the calamity, or we attempt to drive ourselves deeper into the status quo, the old equilibrium, and thereby miss the point entirely. Whether a wake-up call becomes a boon or a bane depends on what we're willing to learn from it, and whether we're willing to be moved by the experience. The outcome depends not on how strong we are, but on how we are strong. Not just any kind of strength will suffice in the face of a wake-up call. Physical strength may be virtually useless. A strong will may only make things worse, and the ability to withstand pain may work against us. We may instead need to call on the strength to surrender. One surprise of saying no to a call is that not everyone who hesitates is lost. Had Jack Meanwell, for instance, said yes to his calling when he wanted to, he wouldn't have been able to do it the way he wanted to. So although he didn't plan to do so, he waited 25 years to become the abstract painter he'd always wanted to be. After returning from World War II, Jack lived in Windsor, Ontario, working as a commercial artist. His father-in-law had at the time a one-person coffee company in Cincinnati and offered Jack a partnership and a 40% interest in a business with a negative net worth. He also offered $50 a week. Jack was earning $35. Although he felt he could paint on the side, and did for many years, he often got sidetracked by the arguments of practicality. The work of keeping a business from going bankrupt, a house from falling down, and a wife and children in decent spirits kept him away from his painting for years at a stretch. 25 years is a long time to be doing something when you'd rather be doing something else, and sometimes Jack thought to himself, if you're in something for 25 years, you're in it for life. Yet one of the things Jack discovered during all those years is that callings aren't fragile, and they don't give up. You may give up. You may throw up your hands in disgust and despair, but the search party will not retire. Jack's turning point began to take shape when he took on a partner himself. Now the owner of the Wallingford Coffee Company, Jack hired a man who lived, ate, slept, and breathed the business, and expected Jack to do the same. Whenever Jack had an art show or a mention in the paper, his partner became angry, furious that he wouldn't give that up to work 12 hours a day instead of 10. In 1972, his partner sent Jack a certified letter. Either buy me out or sell out. You have 90 days to make your decision. If Jack had decided to buy him out, as he put it, I'd have been working for the bank for the next 10 years, paying off what I would have had to borrow to buy him out, and kiss the dream of being a painter goodbye. I thought I might never have another chance like this at my painting, and I was at an age when it still made sense to go for it. He also realized that at that point in his life, the call demanded that he wake up in the middle of the American dream. A picture postcard life with 3 children, a house in the suburbs, a station wagon, and a family dog. But at 53, Jack, who described himself as always the safe, conservative, orderly, no-waves type, sold his 50% share of the business, divorced his wife of 27 years, took custody of his 15-year-old daughter, became a painter, and moved into a small studio in the artists section of town, which all fits neatly into a run-on sentence, but it reflected a decision that was awful and harrowing, as Jack put it, like jumping into a freezing cold lake. I had a tremendous amount of indecision, not the least of which was because the coffee business was booming, which made it very hard to get out. The 90-day deadline helped, and, as he said, it also appealed to the heroic in me. Jack knew full well what some people would say, and he also knew that people do not need paintings to help them wake up in the morning. After 25 years, however, this no-waves type obviously felt more at home in the surf, largely because by the time he finally took on his calling, he was in a much better position to make it happen. He had been able to build up his skills, his portfolio, his contacts, and his bank account, and he could comfortably and securely raise a family. Jack also had 25 years' worth of business skills, and had learned a few things about how a product sells, which taught him how to navigate in an art world where gallery owners often seem to believe that genius flourishes best in penury, and the market for abstract painting is often small enough to fit inside a hobo's handbag, with room left over for sculptors and poets. Eventually, Jack was earning several $1,000s for a painting, whereas in the beginning he would trade a painting for a tank of gas. Had he gone into painting right out of art school as he had wanted to, the struggle would likely have crushed his spirits. The waiting and the strain of keeping his painting career at arm's length for 25 years also might have, but it didn't. In fact, by the time opportunity allowed him to make good on his calling, he wanted it like a man who's been forced underwater wants a lungful of air. Sometimes we don't know until much, much later whether a course of action is right or wrong, and whether saying no to a calling might turn out to be the best decision. Saying yes to calls. Following a call takes courage, and courage, like risk, is absolutely relative. What is courageous to one may be faint-hearted to another. Risk is whatever scares you. It is the threshold we are required to cross before we can lean down to our passions lying dormant and kiss them awake. The double entendre of threshold is fitting. A threshold is a place of passage, a portal through which we pass from here to there and from known to unknown. But it also means a measure of endurance. If we can increase our threshold for crossing thresholds, we can transcend some of the limits of life, and we can change our lives in the most prodigious ways. If a worm can grow wings and become a butterfly, can reap a complete change in physical form from one creature to an entirely other, what then is possible for us? There is no shortage of answers that are simple to declare and complicated to execute for how one gets hold of such courage. John Graham, co-director of the Giraffe Project, dedicated to publicizing stories of people who stick their necks out for the common good, insists that all answers share at least one commonality. There is a very clear link, he says, between courage and the degree of meaning in one's life. The sense at a really deep level that you know why you do things, you know what your life is about. Most fear is fear of the unknown, but when you can answer this root question of what your life is about, that root insecurity is dealt with, and dealing with it makes it so that no fear is as bad as it was before. The more meaning, the more courage, and the less fear. I occasionally find myself in the position of advising others who feel called to leave employment for self-employment, having done it myself. People for whom this departure is the source of endless daydreams and sleepless nights. And rightly so, for this is scary stuff. It requires letting go of deep familiarities, a mindset, a lifestyle, a trade. I heartily do not recommend that people just up and quit their jobs, unless the prospect of financial ruin and emotional turmoil is preferable to the emotional and spiritual death they're experiencing at work. As Henry David Thoreau once said, the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation, but it is a characteristic of wisdom not to do desperate things. Many times I myself came a hair's breadth away from quitting my job out of desperation and was stopped only by a stubborn survival instinct. More frequently, I was talked out of it by someone who knew better. Who knew that if I attempted to begin self-employment without preparing for the rigors of that business, as well as starting a new venture in the emotionally shell-shocked aftermath of quitting a job in desperation, that I would likely drown. One friend, an environmentalist, pointed out that sudden transitions in nature are usually catastrophic. Eruptions, earthquakes, flash floods. The skill that seems most essential for such leaps is a certain feel for ripeness. It is having the patience to abide the growing season and develop a subtle sense of touch, and the understanding that whatever the outcome of risk, of letting go of the tree, the point is always the moving on of life. Whether the fruit is eaten by a passing animal, harvested on a farm, or simply melts slowly into the ground on some back acre of a forest, the fat, succulent demand is always for more life. The move from employment to self-employment is one of life's dramatic thresholds, so I encourage people to offer an obedient bow to the gods of time and the harvest, and to give this transition the attention and patience it needs. I do not even consider it extreme to wait 5 years or more to phase out one way of life properly and phase in another. Your outer circumstances need time to be readjusted, as do your inner ones. For instance, the mindset of being employed, your attitudes toward responsibility and self-management, and your attitude toward discipline and the definition of success. All of these take great drafts of time and sustained risk-taking to rework themselves. Meanwhile, you need the courage to wait, which can be wearisome work that resembles nothing so much as sitting up nights with a feverish child. The very act of risk-taking sets up an antagonism with the established order of things. In creating lives based on our callings, we may have to break the rules, disappoint people, part ways with colleagues and friends, refashion our marriage vows. Occasionally the risks are mortal. For some people, their calls have brought them into very real lines of fire. Threats, jail, excommunication, loss of community, rocks thrown through the living room window, crosses burning on the front lawn. Jesus promised those who would follow him only 3 things, says writer Marty Babcock: that they would be absurdly happy, entirely fearless, and always in trouble. To keep our balance amidst the troubles that ensue in taking risks, some measure of order and safety is critical, just as one arm of a drawing compass swings free only because the other one is anchored. Some useful anchors to have when following calls include money in the bank, a plan B to fall back on, a support group, and people who believe in you. When someone who is about to take a leap is reminded by even a single loved one that he or she will be loved whether the endeavor flies or flops, it makes it easier to leap and much easier to flop. Risk-taking should not become a theology, however. Sometimes it is merely a disguised form of escape, or a kind of repetition compulsion in itself, a blind urge to prove our wills superior, to refuse to be scared, to idolize the river gods who personify eternal change. Sometimes hanging in there or exercising creativity within the status quo is the better part of valor. Before taking a leap, establish whether a particular status quo in your life is a monument to the fear of change, and whether the risk to which you're attracted is a function of sheer restlessness and ennui. Nothing is inherently wrong with either status quo or restlessness, but if you're taking chances and making changes just for the sake of not standing still, your actions may be more about running away from something than moving towards something. Motion is not necessarily progress, any more than noise is necessarily music. The desire to protect ourselves from change probably does more harm to the flowering of human life and spirit than almost any other choice, but it is imperative to understand something about security. It isn't secure. Everything about security is contrary to the central fact of existence. Life changes. By trying to shelter ourselves from change, we isolate ourselves from living. By avoiding risk, we may feel safe and secure, or at least experience a tolerable parody thereof, but we don't avoid the harangues of our consciences. It's almost axiomatic that the important risks we don't take now become the regrets we have later. In fact, I was once told that if I'm not failing regularly, I'm living so far below my potential that I'm failing anyway. The more time we spend locked in our studies with our slippers by the desk, our books arranged alphabetically on the shelves, and our pencils sharpened just the way we like them, the less time we have to frighten ourselves with the uncertainties of the road and the anxieties of adventure. We can comfort ourselves with the thought that if none of our dreams come true, then at least neither will our nightmares. Hidden deep in the clockworks of the heart, though, is the beneficent fear of living life, as Henry Miller once put it, without ever leaving the birdcage, and we need to touch that fear. Outside the cage, the sun is roaring with fission, arching through the blue sky. Wild winds flap the flags and fill the air with the sound of songs caught up in ecstasy and longing. There is life in its fleshy and toothsome grandeur, all the spill and stomp and shout of it, all the come and go of it, all of it on the one hand waiting for us to act, and on the other rushing down the hourglass. Faith contains a certain ferocity, an unspoken demand that to maintain it, we part ways with comfort and give up something we have for something we want. We may have to relinquish the precious commodities of time and energy, or something that represents security to us, or simply whatever internal resistance stands in our way. We may have to cede our intractable self-doubt, or the false composure, the bliss of ignorance, bred by living unconsciously and avoiding risk. Faith will eventually ask of the faithful, what are you willing to give up in order to follow your call? Sacrifice, says Thomas More, is the shadow in the calling. It reminds us that we pay a price for every choice, and that life doesn't hold still. It constantly gives over this for that. It wears down its banks and changes course. It's a propeller that spins so fast it only appears to be solid, but you don't dare try and grasp it. A few years ago, after 2 years of maddening indecision and the escalating entreaties of my partner, I finally agreed to move, for the first time, from the city to the country. Or more precisely, from San Francisco to a desert in northern New Mexico surrounded by the silence of interstellar places, a night so black that I remembered a childhood fear of the dark. In the Albuquerque airport, I saw a man wearing a button that said, "Welcome to New Mexico, land of the flea, home of the plague." We later learned that some of the state's outlying areas, not far from where we were headed in fact, have a problem with fleas that carry the bubonic plague, which killed a fourth of the population of medieval Europe. As I headed for baggage claim, I heard in the back of my mind the words of the poet Rilke, reminding me that the purpose of life is to be defeated by greater and greater things, and I had the uneasy sense that I had come to the right place. I had 100 reasons not to move, 101 including the fleas, and 100 reasons why I had to. Among those I was able to articulate to inquiring and skeptical friends and family were that I needed a place where nature lifts up her skirt and dances, where the cost of living is somewhat more hospitable to a freelance writer, and where there are no job opportunities for traffic reporters. I was less inclined to try to explain that I wanted a place where what is of value is not advertised, where there are no guardrails, where I might find an answer to the question, is this all there is? And because my partner wanted to move and I didn't want to lose her. Beneath all the reasons and rationalizations was also an undefined yearning for change, and I knew in some private core of myself that it had something to do with surrender, which nature and midlife excel at teaching. For a long while, living in the wilderness was overwhelming. During the first few months, I slept 12 hours a day and barely left the house for more than a few hours at a time. The scale of the mountains, the sky, the horizon, everything made a mockery of my sense of perspective. The 100-mile visibility seemed to double the size of the world, making me feel very small. The passage of time, which was marked not on the human scale of weekdays and weekends, but in epochs, argued that even the mountains are mortal. The perverse silence of the place kept startling my reptilian brain into idle chatter. The Indian and Spanish cultures felt alien. Hail was the size of marbles. Flash floods were capable of carrying off children, livestock, and large appliances, and thunder sounded like gunshots going off next to my ear. I wrote to a friend that I felt like a coward in the face of such grandeur, which accused me of my own impotence and stripped me of the hubris that I had developed from being a city dweller surrounded by the man-made my whole life. It is easy to imagine yourself king of the hill when only the rumor of death instructs you otherwise. Jacques Cousteau once remarked that when you enter the ocean, you enter the food chain, and you do not necessarily enter at the top. When it snowed in New Mexico and the land filled up with paw prints, I too saw clearly what my relative position is in the colossi, and that I do not have tenure. I followed bear tracks for a mile along a mountain fire road, and mountain lion tracks on the mesa running like a dotted line between the junipers. I saw blood on the snow, and was left hyperventilating by the sound of rustling. I followed bear tracks for a mile along a mountain fire road, and mountain lion tracks on the mesa running like a dotted line between the junipers. I saw blood on the snow, and was left hyperventilating by the sound of rustling. I suppose that feeling out of control made the incident with the magpie so unnerving. I was sitting at my desk one afternoon several months after moving, staring out the window at columns of thunderheads while the wind pounded on kettle drums outside. Suddenly a bird flew directly into the window with a bony thud and bounced off, leaving a clump of feathers stuck to the glass. I stood up reflexively. A meadowlark lay stunned on the ground. At just that instant, a magpie 3 times the meadowlark's size barreled down from a nearby tree and pecked the small bird to death as it flapped around helplessly. When it was dead, the magpie took it in its beak up to a low branch of the apricot tree, set it there, and flew off. I stumbled outside, horrified, wondering what act of carnage I had just witnessed. Was it the end of a chase? Some violent spasm of territorial imperative? Or was it a mercy killing? I felt my sense of vulnerability in being there at all deepen in that moment. 4 days later, that clump of feathers was still stuck to my office window like a suicide note, and I was still rattled, not just by the violence or the suddenness of it, but more because I didn't understand what it meant, and this reminded me of what I gave up to move there. It is something that all sacrifices on behalf of a calling require, whatever their particulars. The need to let go of what is familiar for what is not, to relinquish full jurisdiction over our lives and let fate have a greater hand in them. A few days before I left California, for instance, I walked slowly through and around my house, a fixer-upper I had lived in longer than any since childhood. I realized how intimately I knew it and how bad I felt in leaving it. I knew how many seconds it took the bathroom faucet to make hot water, where to step to avoid creaking the wooden floors when I was up at 2:30 a.m., and how stiff a wind it took to drive rain into the broken storm window upstairs. I knew which tree the vultures most favored for roosting, which trails on the surrounding hills would be muddiest after a rain, and the names and temperaments of every dog in the neighborhood. I knew which week during September the robins would fly in to gorge themselves on the pyracantha berries near my front steps, and that during that week I'd sweep those steps of bird droppings twice a day. I knew that if I heard rustling in the vicinity of the pampas grass in the front yard, it would be Boozy, the neighbor's big, dumb dog of indeterminate genus, and I knew exactly where to rub Boozy's chest to paralyze him with pleasure and make his back left foot twitch. And I knew that starting in a few days, by choice, I would be a stranger again, would have to start learning all new coordinates, the habits of all new birds and beasts, find my way around unfamiliar territory, and figure out what all the signs mean. I remember walking along a dirt road near my new home in New Mexico a few days after arriving, and being barked at furiously by the dogs at a farmhouse, and feeling hurt by it. "We're going to be friends someday," I yelled, jabbing my finger at them. "You just wait." The magpie incident pushed me deeper into this sense of loss and fragility, of not knowing. In the months after I buried the meadowlark, however, I chose, quite uncharacteristically, to stay in suspense about what had happened to him, when one phone call to the ornithology department at the University of New Mexico could have settled the matter, as well as my sense of disquiet. But I didn't call. I wondered. One afternoon I even spent several hours speculating on the lives of birds, their compulsions and their conspiracies, as I watched a group of gray juncos outside my house repeatedly flock to the ground, peck for seeds, and suddenly, as if on some invisible cue, explode into flight in every direction like shrapnel from a grenade, and then regather slowly on the ground like fallen leaves. Then one day, I stopped wondering. I called the ornithology department at the university and ended my little murder mystery. Magpies, the young woman told me, are thievish and opportunistic, and will take advantage of an injured bird for the sake of an easy meal. That, she said with great certainty, is what I saw. I hung up feeling oddly disappointed, not in the cruelty of nature, but in the cruelty of certitude. The knowing, that is, put an end to the wondering, which in many ways was far more entertaining and instructive. In it, there was room for imagination and discovery, for the quest implied in question. The truth, it seems, did not set me free. In hanging on to the familiar, I have what is familiar. But in letting go, in moving into the unknown, I have no idea what comes next. Life becomes a cloud rolling overhead, changing shape moment by moment like a moving Rorschach, and the only thing I know for sure is that I am, like the magpie, resourceful, and like the meadowlark, vulnerable. We moor our callings in the world by seeking the aid of anyone or anything, says James Hillman, that will help us touch the common ground so that we can reach for the uncommon ground. This can include the basic advocacy of friends and mentors, the steadfastness of certain practices and beliefs, and the stability of place, of staying put somewhere for a spell, which gives us solid ground on which to pivot. We may be helped by many things, dreams or intuitions or just inexplicable faith, the solace we reap from books, the support we gain from our participation in any group whose members are working toward awakening and self-remembering, the memory of a father or mother, or the part of ourselves that never went to sleep, or simply the remembrance that life is short and death is long. People who understand the struggle involved in following a call may provide encouraging counsel that helps overcome the drag of inertia and fear because they've struggled successfully with their own callings. You don't want advice from a do what I say, not what I do type, but from those who are busy with calls of their own. They understand that when we talk about a calling, we're speaking of an encounter with divinity, with the deep soul, which must be honored. These people are most capable of propelling us into the greatest strides in growth and the profoundest changes in the course of our lives because they've witnessed and esteemed what is deepest in us, even if we've cried wolf a time or two before. They also love us robustly, bear no major grudges against us, and take us seriously. The help we need may simply be the added backbone of our own affirmative inner work. Meditation, prayer, therapy, or self-talk designed to seed the brain with messages of confidence rather than pessimism. To some degree, success is a numbers game. We're after the kind of momentum bred by a team effort, which can give us the considerable energy needed to escape the gravity of self-doubt. A speed of 25,000 miles per hour is needed to escape the pull of Earth, 133,000 miles per hour to quit Jupiter, 1,368,000 miles per hour against the Sun. The bigger the home planet, the greater will be the pull of the past and the familiar, the greater the exertion required to pull away, and the greater will be the need for a little help from your friends. Instead of just searching for advice on what to do to respond to your callings, tell others what they can do for you. Guide the guides by telling them exactly what kind of help you need. If you don't specify, if you just tell people to help you or that you feel stuck, they're likely to try to diagnose what sort of help you seem to need and administer it however they see fit. Tell them precisely what you need. I need so many minutes a day of listening and asking questions. I need the name of someone who teaches photography here in town. I want your advice on how to go about teaching abroad. Tell me I'm not crazy. While preparing for the rigors of full-time freelance writing, for example, I plied a lot of writers with drinks and victuals, beseeching them for the lowdown. I became the reporter I was. What is it really like? What do you love and hate about it? What skills are essential to cultivate before making the leap? What do you wish someone had told you? Among the advice I was given was the strong suggestion to break down all long-term goals into bite-sized pieces, because by disassembling the call, it won't seem so intimidating. The only goals with any power, I was told, are the ones on tomorrow's to-do list, because they're the only ones I can get my hands on. The big ones are out of my control. You can't become a famous writer overnight, one fellow said, but you can write 2 pages a day. Just as in monastic life, in which there are periods of being a candidate and a novitiate before the taking of vows, so in life our calls are also tested. We are tempted away and distracted. We hear the siren song of old habits and addictions. We feel pure laziness and amnesia. We discover the cold necessities of life. Joseph Campbell called this part of the heroic journey the road of trials, which winds between the epiphany and the grind, between the heart flushed with heroic song and the heart with its human frailties. On this road we answer the elemental question of whether our commitments are real or imagined. The ordeals on this endless road, the dragons that have to be slain over and over again, serve to test us, like the Sphinx who confronted Oedipus before he could continue his journey, teach us humility and a sense of proper perspective, and help to reveal our hidden powers. The first power for which we may be tested is our ability to prevail over setbacks. In mythic parlance, this means to transmute flax into gold. We may set out on the road in a great caravan, or set out to sea with champagne splattered lustily on our bows, but somewhere out there we come to realize that life is a great devourer, and dreams get swallowed at an alarming rate. Deserted bones litter many a dead beach, reminders of the temptations to which all of us are always in danger of succumbing. Furthermore, the soul doesn't care at all what price we have to pay to follow our calls. Our happiness and security and status simply don't matter to it, although our courage, faith, and aliveness do. Unfortunately, as Helen Keller once observed, there is plenty of courage among us for the abstract, but not for the concrete. Dreams rarely stir up much trouble, but acting on them does. In taking on your calls, watch what you wish for, because you may get it. It's one thing to wish devoutly for a thing, and often quite another to get it. You may thank the lords of manifestation for bringing you a certain job offer, and only later realize that it turned you into a workaholic. You may pride yourself on having the courage to stop whatever you were doing and do something new, but underestimate the effort and ungainliness involved in being a rookie again. You may follow the call to make good on a talent, and in the process find out that the true dimensions of that talent aren't quite what you thought. The gods have two ways of dealing harshly with us, Oscar Wilde once said. The first is to deny us our dreams, and the second is to grant them. When we follow a calling, we don't know what the consequences will be. We might dance rain out of the sky, or we might pull down a tornado. In Annie Dillard's book An American Childhood, she tells the story of her father quitting the family firm to follow a long-held dream of sailing the Mississippi River from their home in Pittsburgh to New Orleans, home of the music he loved, Dixieland jazz. On the adventure he'd long imagined, he found the river lonesome. He wasn't so much free as loose, Dillard writes. He was living alone on beans in a boat and having witless conversations with lockmasters. He mailed out sad postcards. It doesn't serve us to press to our oars as if there aren't any rocks in the water, as if we can't be troubled with obstacles, as if they simply don't fit into our grand schemes, and then when they suddenly appear, to resent them their interruptions. It doesn't serve the cause to set out with a failure is not in my vocabulary attitude. Life is likely to make a liar out of you. If we insist that only X is a good outcome, then whenever Y happens, we'll fight against it and be in turmoil. This is actually the natural response, because every time something doesn't live up to our expectations, it recapitulates the original betrayals in our young lives, the ones when paradise was lost. Someone didn't come when we cried, someone died unexpectedly, our needs weren't met, people were imperfect, we didn't get what we wanted. Some of that outrage is still in there. It is better to adopt the old pioneer maxim, expect nothing, be prepared for anything. As the English novelist G.K. Chesterton advises, an adventure is only an inconvenience rightly considered. An inconvenience is only an adventure wrongly considered. An ordeal may serve the purpose of shaking us loose from our moorings in order to set us up for important changes we can't see or imagine yet. Perhaps many of us carry the expectation that if we're following the right call, if we're doing the brave thing, no ordeals will drag us down with their despicable gravity. If it's meant to be, doors will swing open and whatever we touch will spontaneously burst into flame or gold. If we bear the cross, we'll automatically get to wear the crown. But if we run into opposition, it means something's wrong. More likely, however, it means something within us is changing, that our expectations are having a rude light thrown on them. Expectations are setups, and chances are excellent that they'll come back to haunt us, though the laws of chance do cut both ways. Sometimes what we hope for doesn't materialize, and sometimes what we wouldn't dare hope for does materialize. Expectations narrow our focus, so that when circumstances have to pry open our retinas, we tend to resent the circumstances and not the expectations. Although it's almost impossible not to have expectations, it pays to be aware of them, to have at least a working familiarity with what we think is going to happen when we say yes to a calling. Otherwise, we get caught off guard too easily and end up courting cynicism, which theologian Matthew Fox describes as having had high ideals and empty results. The results may not have been actually empty, of course, but because they didn't match our expectations, we didn't consider them rightly. As we pursue our callings and as circumstances unfold, it also pays to stay open to a great variety of possible outcomes, even those that would never enter our minds. Listen for further instructions buried in the fling of activities. When we say yes to our callings, when we make of ourselves a gift to the life of the soul, that life reciprocates. Our right actions and devoted enthusiasms seem to set up something akin to a magnetic field that draws to us benedictions and resources that can help us realize the calling. I've seen it work this way far too many times for far too many people to be cynical of it at this point. When people begin to follow their calls, the way opens up, even after they have kept the gods drumming their fingers for decades, pacing around in the front hall while they take forever in the boudoir getting ready. Opportunities wash up on shore. People take an interest. Out of the corner of your eye you spy synchronicities. The right book or the right person crosses your path. Sometimes even the money follows. Perhaps it's nothing more mysterious than the universe supporting growth and life loving itself. As we follow our calls, it is also important to shout a few hosannas about our progress, to throw our caps in the air in celebration of how far we've come from where we started, and to be unafraid that if we count our blessings out loud, we'll somehow jinx everything. We shouldn't be reduced to counting our blessings. Oh well, at least I still have A, B, and C. Celebration ought to be part of the path, beginning with acknowledgement that the fulfillment of the call is part of the gratitude for the call. Besides, since we may not even reach our goals, or they may change radically before we arrive at them, it's vital to give ourselves plenty of gratification along the way, honoring ourselves for the work we've done, spilling not just tears, but champagne. Sometimes half of success is simply noticing it. When I was working at the Cincinnati Enquirer, I once received a phone call from a woman who told me that an article I'd written about the will to live had saved a man's life. He was someone she worked with at the local hospice, someone who had given up trying, until she pulled up a chair and read him the story. She said it completely changed his mind, brought him back to life, as she put it. She also completely changed my sense of my own work. I no longer despaired of being a solitary voice in the wilderness, uncertain whether it mattered a whit that I told my stories, followed my calling, in fact, did anything at all. But it does matter, and here's why I think so. Recently, I spent a day hiking deep into Redwood National Forest along the California coast, and at one point stopped beside a creek to tape record some thoughts. In the middle of a sentence, I was jolted by a loud, sharp crack some 50 feet behind me, like the side of a house splitting. A huge branch broke off and smashed to the forest floor, leaving me hyperventilating. But I got it on tape, thus proving, at least to my mind, that if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear, it does make a sound. And if one lone person hears a calling and follows the heart, and then speaks out with honesty and conviction in the truest voice they have, then however deep the forest, it too will make a sound.